The horse found her first. Caleb Rourke had been riding with his head down against the wind for the better part of 2 hours, and Ghost, a gray quarter horse with the disposition of a mule and the stubbornness to match, had stopped dead on the trail without warning. Caleb nearly pitched forward over the animal's neck. He swore, pulled the reins back out of reflex, and looked up, expecting a fallen tree or maybe a spooked elk. What he saw instead stopped his breath entirely. She was half buried in a drift at the base of a pine tree, maybe 15 yards off the trail. The snow had come up past her waist, and her body was folded at an angle that made something clench hard in Caleb's chest. Her coat, dark wool, the expensive kind with brass buttons, or what had been brass buttons before 3 of them were torn clean off, was soaked through. One of her boots was missing. Her bare foot had gone from white to a gray-blue color that Caleb recognized as something a man couldn't come back from if it was allowed to progress much further. He sat there on Ghost's back for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. It was January of 1887 in the Montana Territory, and Caleb Rourke was not a man given to acts of charity. He was 34 years old, had spent the last 8 years deliberately building a life that required as little involvement with other people as possible, and had chosen this particular stretch of the Bitterroot foothills precisely because nobody came through it without reason. The nearest town was Harlan's Creek, 11 miles south, and Caleb made the trip maybe once a month for supplies he couldn't produce himself. He had no wife, no partners, no obligations he hadn't chosen freely. He looked at the woman in the snow. Then he climbed down from his horse. Getting her out of the drift was harder than he expected. She was dead weight, completely unconscious, not just asleep, and she was bigger than she looked from a distance, taller than most women he'd known, and with a solidity to her frame that made him recalibrate twice before he got her free. She made a sound when he finally pulled her loose, something between a groan and a breath, and that sound cracked something open in the back of his skull and wouldn't let him think straight for the next several seconds. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Her hair was dark, black or very dark brown, hard to tell under the ice crystals matted through it. And her face was sharp-featured, the kind of face that looked severe until you saw the way the lines softened around her mouth. She had a cut above her left eyebrow that had bled and then frozen over. Her lips were cracked. Her lashes had frost on them. Caleb did a quick inventory, hands intact, no visible broken bones in the arm he checked, pulse at her throat faint but regular. The bare foot concerned him most. He pulled his scarf free and wrapped it around the exposed foot, then carried her to Ghost. The horse shifted sideways but didn't bolt. Caleb talked to him low while he maneuvered the woman across the saddle. She was too far gone to hold herself upright, so he settled her stomach down over the horse's back like cargo, which felt wrong and brutal but was the only workable option. He kept one hand on her as he led Ghost by the reins, walking the remaining 1.5 miles to his cabin. It took 40 minutes in the wind. He didn't think about what he was doing during those 40 minutes. Thinking too hard about things was how a man talked himself out of them. The cabin was small. 2 rooms, a main living space with a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, and a back room that served as both sleeping quarters and storage. Caleb had built it himself over the course of 3 summers with help from exactly nobody, and it wasn't pretty by any measure, but it was solid. The logs were chinked properly. The roof didn't leak. The floor was packed earth with plank boards laid over it that he'd replaced twice in 8 years when they'd started to rot. He got the woman inside and onto his cot in the back room, stripped her outer layers, the ruined coat, a wool dress beneath it that was equally soaked, a pair of stockings, working quickly and without particular thought because the cold was the enemy right now and embarrassment was a luxury neither of them had. He found dry blankets in the cedar chest at the foot of the cot, wrapped her in 2 of them, then went back out to the main room and built the fire up until the stone fireplace was radiating heat that he could feel from across the room. He put water on to boil. He sought a Ghost, brought him into the lean-to attached to the back of the cabin where the other 2 horses were stabled, threw him hay, and broke the ice in the water trough. When he came back inside, the woman hadn't moved. She woke up on the 2nd day. Caleb had slept, in pieces, sitting in the chair he'd dragged in from the main room, and had kept the fire going through the night, and had managed to get some hot water with a little salt and broth from the pot into her while she was still half unconscious, coaxing it past her lips 1 sip at a time the way he'd seen a man do once with a half-drowned calf. Her eyes opened around mid-morning. He happened to be sitting beside the cot when it happened, mending a length of harness leather that needed attention, and he looked up and found her staring at the ceiling with an expression of careful, suspended blankness, the kind of expression a person wore when they were taking stock of where they were before letting themselves react. He'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone who'd learned caution. "You're at my cabin," he said, "about 11 miles north of Harlan's Creek. I found you in a snowdrift off the Ridgeline Trail." Her eyes moved to him slowly. She had green eyes, not the bright, obvious green that people described when they talked about green-eyed women. This was darker, more complicated, the color of pine needles in shadow. They were taking him apart and cataloging the pieces. "How long?" she said. Her voice was rough from disuse and cold, barely more than a scrape of sound. "This is the morning of your second day." She was quiet for a moment, then, "My foot. I got to it before the worst of it set in. You've got some frostbite on 2 toes. It'll be painful when it's fully thawed out. Already started to blister some, which is actually a good sign. Means there's circulation there." He paused. "You're not going to lose them." Something in her face shifted, a release of tension she'd been holding without being aware of it. Then the mask came back up, smooth and immediate. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it." He went back to the harness. "Da." She gave him her name 2 days later when she was sitting up and capable of holding a cup without assistance. "Eliza," she said. "Eliza Ward." Caleb Rourke. They were in the main room by then, her wrapped in one of his heavier wool blankets and positioned in the chair closest to the fire. He'd given her a pair of his socks, thick wool ones, to keep her feet warm, and they were comically oversized on her feet, bunching around her ankles. She hadn't commented on them. "Ward," he said. "Where are you from, Miss Ward?" "East," she said. It was the kind of answer that wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. Caleb let it sit. "How did you end up on the Ridgeline Trail in a January storm with 1 boot?" he asked. He was stirring a pot of venison stew on the iron stove, not looking at her. A pause. "My horse threw me. I'd been riding since before dark. I wasn't paying attention to the trail the way I should have been, and the horse spooked at something and I went over. I don't know where the horse went. I managed to walk for a while, but the weather came in faster than I expected." It was plausible. He had heard worse explanations for people ending up in trouble on the trail, but there were things that didn't sit right with the story, things he filed away without comment. The quality of her coat, which he'd had time to look at properly while it dried by the fire. The stitching was fine work, the fabric expensive. The torn buttons weren't ordinary brass. They were engraved, some kind of insignia on them that he hadn't examined closely but had noticed. There was a bruise along her jaw that had nothing to do with falling off a horse, and her hands, when he'd wrapped them to check for frostbite, had been the hands of someone who worked indoors. Smooth palms, no calluses to speak of, nails trimmed even and short. "None of this," he said. "You're welcome to stay until the weather clears and your feet are healed enough to travel," he said. "After that, we can get you to Harlan's Creek." "I appreciate that," she said. Something in her voice made it clear she understood he wasn't asking questions, and that she understood why, and that this silence between them was a kind of arrangement. "I'll try not to be a burden." "You won't be," he said, which was neither generosity nor reassurance, just a statement of what he intended to allow. The weather didn't clear for 6 days. A second storm rolled in the morning after she first woke up, piling another 1.5 feet of snow against the cabin door and making the temperature outside drop low enough that even the creek to the east of the property went quiet under a shell of ice. They were snowed in together, 2 strangers in a 2-room cabin, with a collection of supplies that Caleb had laid in for exactly this kind of situation, but that hadn't accounted for 2 people eating. He rationed the venison and supplemented with smoked elk and dried beans. She didn't complain and didn't comment on the fact that portions were smaller than they might have been. She also didn't stay in the back room and let him wait on her, which he'd half expected. By the 3rd day, she was up and moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd had a medical person's voice in their head telling them to take it easy but was tired of listening. She boiled water. She washed their dishes in the basin. She found the mending basket and picked up a shirt he'd been meaning to get to for 2 weeks without asking. and did it with the quick competence of someone who'd mended their own clothes for years. He watched her, in the sideways way he watched anything he was uncertain about, not openly, just noticing. The thing about her movements was that they were practiced, but they were the wrong kind of practiced. She knew how to cook and clean and mend, but she'd learned it the way a person learns things they've been required to learn, with a mild precision that came from instruction rather than habit. She knew how to make food, but she worked in a kitchen the way someone does when they've been taught proper technique, efficient and technically correct, and without any of the absent-minded ease of someone who'd been doing it since childhood. He filed that away too. On the fourth evening, she asked him about the horses. 3, he said. They were eating dinner, the dried beans with a little salt pork, not particularly exciting, and she'd asked the question out of what seemed like genuine curiosity, not an attempt to fill silence. Ghost's the one you rode in on. The other 2 are working animals. I use them for the trap lines and for hauling. You trap? Season's almost done now, but yes. What do you do with the pelts? Sell them in Harlan's Creek. Some go through a buyer there who ships them east. He paused. It's not the main income. I have a small cattle operation, 40 head, which isn't much, and I do some work for the logging outfits when they need someone who knows the terrain. She nodded slowly, like she was filing this away in the same way he filed things away. You've been here 8 years, you said. Did I say that? The first morning. When you were explaining where we were, you mentioned you'd built the place over 3 summers. He hadn't said 8 years. She'd calculated it from what he had said. He took a sip of the coffee, a poor excuse for coffee, mostly chicory, and looked at the fire. 8 years, he confirmed. Where were you before? Farther east. She looked at him. There was the beginning of something in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite amusement, and then it was gone. I see. We're even then, he said. This time the beginning of a smile made it all the way to something real, brief, and a little crooked. I suppose we are. He caught her at the window on the 5th morning. He came in from checking on the horses to find her standing at the small north-facing window that looked out past the woodpile toward the ridge, holding the edge of the curtain back with 2 fingers and looking out with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the careful blankness she showed him, or the measured pleasantness she'd maintained through 5 days of close quarters. This was something that lived deeper, a combination of fear and calculation, and something else underneath both of those that he couldn't name from across the room. She heard him come in and let the curtain fall. Thought I heard something, she said, turning, back to the measured, pleasant expression. Probably the wind. It moves the trees around up on the ridge. He hung his coat. Or it could be elk. There's a small herd that works through this area, uses the ridge as a windbreak. Yes, she said. Probably that. He went to the stove. He didn't push it. That night, after she'd gone back to the rear room, and he was sitting up by the fire with his back to the wall, the way he always slept when something was making the back of his neck prickle, he tried to put together what he knew into something coherent. The expensive clothes. The lie about where she was from. Not a clumsy lie, a practiced one, the kind of deflection that came naturally. The bruise that hadn't come from a horse. The way she watched the tree line. The calculation behind her eyes that never fully went away, even when she was laughing. Someone had hurt this woman. Someone was, or had recently been, looking for her. He considered what that meant for him. In the morning, he went about his business. Well, the storm broke on the 6th day and the sun came out so hard and white off the snow that it was almost painful. Caleb spent the morning clearing the paths between the cabin, the lean-to, and the woodpile. And when he came inside for the midday meal, she was at the table with paper and a pencil. His pencil, from the ledger he kept near the window, writing something. She closed the paper over when she heard him come in. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I should have asked before I used your things. Paper's just paper. He washed his hands at the basin. Writing a letter? A pause. Trying to sort out some thoughts. He left it there. After they'd eaten, the last of the salt pork, which he was not going to miss, she asked him directly for the first time about Harlan's Creek. When do you think the trail south will be passable? Day after tomorrow, maybe. The temperature's going to stay above freezing now. This one breaks for good. He looked at her. There's a stagecoach runs through Harlan's Creek 3 times a week. You could get to Missoula from there or south toward Idaho. She nodded, her eyes on the table. I'll need to get some money first. I can repay you for... You don't owe me anything, Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. Rourke attached, and it landed differently than he'd expected. I'm not the kind of person who accepts things without accounting for them properly. Then we can call it the cost of stumbling onto someone who needed help, he said. I'm not running a hotel. Something moved across her face. Not the calculation, something simpler than that. Thank you, she said, for not asking. I might still ask, he said honestly. When you're more yourself. I don't know if you'd like the answers. I don't know if I'd need to. He stood, taking his plate to the basin. Either way, it's not today's problem. The day before the trail would be clear, Caleb rode Ghost down toward the lower meadow to check on the cattle that wintered there in a rough shelter he'd built against a natural rock outcropping. It was a 2-hour ride round trip, and he'd been putting it off because of the weather, and the cattle needed attention regardless of what else was happening at the cabin. He was gone most of the morning. When he came back, he knew immediately that something had changed. He couldn't have said how he knew. Something about the stillness of the cabin, or a quality of the air when he opened the door, or the way Eliza was sitting at the table not doing anything at all, just sitting with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes focused on the middle distance. She looked up when he came in, and her face was the controlled, careful blankness again, but tighter than usual. A little too still. Everything all right? He asked. Yes. Then, after a beat, someone came to the door. He stopped taking his coat off. Who? He didn't give his name. He said he was checking on homesteads in the area after the storm, making sure everyone had come through it. She paused. He asked if I lived here. What did you tell him? That I was visiting family. Her voice was steady. He seemed satisfied with that. He left. Caleb stood in the doorway, coat halfway off. What did he look like? She described him precisely. Height, build, coloring, the cut of his coat, the particular shape of his hat, the horse he'd been riding. It was the kind of description a person gave when they'd been trained to observe or when they'd been in situations where the details of strangers' appearances could matter. Did he say where he was from? He mentioned Harlan's Creek, she said, but he wasn't local. The accent was wrong. Caleb finished removing his coat and hung it. He went to the window and looked out, the same north-facing window where he'd found her standing 3 days ago, and scanned the ridge and the trail leading away from it. Nothing visible. But the snow was hard-crusted now, and a careful rider could move across it without leaving a deep track. Eliza, he said, still looking out the window. Yes, the man you described. Was he the kind of man who comes from a family operation, checking on neighbors? Or was he the kind of man someone hires? The silence stretched long enough that he turned to look at her. Her jaw was set hard, and for the first time since he'd pulled her out of the snowdrift, she looked genuinely afraid. Not performing fear, not managing around it. Actually afraid, the way a person is when something they've been trying to stay ahead of has narrowed the gap. The second one, she said quietly. Caleb looked at her for a moment, then he pulled his coat back on. I'll go check the east approach, he said. You should stay away from the windows. He found the second man's tracks about half a mile out on the east trail. 2 horses, moving slowly, doubling back on themselves in a way that wasn't consistent with anyone checking on storm damage. They'd been watching the cabin from the tree line. One set of tracks led away south toward Harlan's Creek. The other circled around behind the ridge to the north and then also went south by a different route. They'd been positioned to watch both approaches. Caleb sat on Ghost at the edge of the tree line and breathed through the cold and thought. 8 years he'd been out here. 8 years of no involvement in things that weren't his concern. No entanglements he hadn't chosen. Nothing complicated. He had a simple operation and a quiet life and a clear conscience, and he slept soundly except when he didn't. He thought about the woman at his table with her hands flat on the surface and that expression of someone who had spent a long time being afraid without anyone seeing it. He thought about the bruise along her jaw. He thought about the buttons on her coat, the engraved ones. Then he turned Ghost south and rode a half-mile down the trail, far enough that the cabin was out of sight, and sat there for a long time looking at the hoofprints in the snow. The men had gone back to Harlan's Creek. They'd come from there, and they'd gone back, which meant they had a base there, which meant whoever had sent them was either already in Harlan's Creek or close enough to it to have established a presence, which meant taking Eliza Ward through Harlan's Creek on the way to the stagecoach was no longer the simple proposition it had seemed the night before. Caleb turned Ghost around and went home. She was waiting, not in the chair, not at the table. She was standing just inside the door when he pushed it open, which meant she'd heard him coming and had positioned herself where she could see who came in before they saw her. The poker from the fireplace was in her right hand, held down at her side with a grip that looked relaxed and was not. He noted the poker and looked at her face. "You found something," she said. "Two men. They were watching from the east tree line. They've gone back toward Harlan's Creek." He closed the door behind him. "You want to tell me what's happening, or would you prefer I make up my own version?" She set the poker down against the wall. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly. More like she was deciding where to start. "My real name isn't Ward," she said. "I didn't think it was. My name is Eliza Hargrove." She watched him. "My father was Arthur Hargrove. He died about 4 months ago. He owned, among other things, Hargrove Continental, the rail and land operation." Caleb was quiet. "You've heard of it," she said. It wasn't a question. Most people in this part of the country have heard of it. Hargrove Continental controlled a significant portion of the rail corridor running north from Utah into the territory, and had land holdings that put a number of other operations to shame. Arthur Hargrove had been one of those names that appeared in newspapers and was referenced in conversations as shorthand for a particular kind of power. Caleb hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about him. He died in the fall? October. It wasn't unexpected. He'd been ill for 2 years. She crossed her arms, not for warmth. He left the controlling interest in the company to me. Not to the board, not to any of his partners. To me. And that created a problem. The word problem is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Her voice had shifted, still controlled, but with an edge in it now, something that had been compressed for a long time. There are men who've been circling that company for years waiting for my father to die. Men who expected that a daughter, raised by a father who never let her near the business directly, would be easy to move aside, or buy out, or... She stopped. There are other methods. The bruise on her jaw, the missing boot, the fact that she'd been alone on a mountain trail in January in a stolen hour between 2 storms. "Who sent the men outside?" he asked. She hesitated for the first time since she'd started talking. "His name is Aldous Crane," she said. The name landed in Caleb's chest like a cold hand closing around his ribs. He didn't say anything for several seconds. He stood very still. "You know that name," Eliza said. She was watching him with those sharp, dark pine eyes. "I know it," he said. "How?" He turned and went to the fire, not because he needed warmth, but because he needed somewhere to put his eyes. He stood with his hands held out toward the heat and looked at the burning wood. "Aldous Crane," he said, "is my father's brother." The silence behind him was absolute. "You're my uncle. Half-uncle, technically. Different mothers. My father and Aldous Crane did not have what you'd call an amicable relationship, and I haven't spoken to the man in 15 years, and I would like to keep it that way." He turned back to face her. "But that's who he is to me." Eliza Hargrove was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not quite shock, not quite calculation. Something in between them that resolved into something else entirely. Something that looked a great deal like the early stages of understanding a very complicated situation in a new way. "He doesn't know you're here," she said slowly, "in this particular cabin." "I wouldn't think so. We don't correspond. But if he's in Harlan's Creek and he has men checking the homesteads in this area, he'll find out." Caleb pulled a chair from the table and sat in it, elbows on his knees. "It's a matter of time. A week, maybe 2, before someone in Harlan's Creek connects my name to this general area and passes that along." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Would he use that? Your connection to me?" "He'd use whatever he could get his hands on." "Would he—" She stopped, started again. "Would he approach you directly?" Caleb looked at the fire for a moment. He thought about Aldous Crane, not the name in newspapers, but the man he'd known at 12 years old, the one who came to the house 3 times, and each time left his father smaller somehow, quieter, like something had been taken. He thought about why he'd ended up 8 years in the Bitterroot foothills. Yes, he said. He would. She sat down across from him. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the fire snapped and the wind worked at the eaves of the cabin, and the two of them sat in the growing dark with the knowledge that the thing she'd been running from had, by some terrible coincidence or cosmic indifference, run straight into the one man in the territory whose family name was already tangled in it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." He looked at her directly. "I'm not sorry you're here." She looked at him. The controlled, measured expression had come down far enough that he could see underneath it. Not all the way, but far enough. She was tired. She'd been afraid for a long time, alone with it, and it had worn her down in ways she'd managed not to show until this moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which needed some work in the near left corner where the log was starting to check. He thought about the men in the tree line. He thought about Harlan's Creek and what was sitting in it. He thought about a half-uncle he hadn't seen in 15 years, and the way his father's face had looked after those 3 visits. "First," he said, "I'm going to make us something to eat. We've got a long conversation ahead of us, and it's better done on a full stomach." She looked at him for a moment, then quietly, tiredly, with a realness that had nothing performed in it. "All right." He got up and went to the stove. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, and the night was coming in hard and clear and cold, the kind of cold that settled into everything and would still be there in the morning, the kind of night that asked you what you were made of and didn't wait politely for the answer. Caleb Rourke put a pot of water on to boil and didn't let himself think about what he'd just gotten himself into. There would be time for that later. There would be time for the complications and the consequences and the question of what it meant that Aldous Crane's men were 11 miles south of here looking for a woman who was currently sitting at his table. For now, there was dinner. And after dinner, there was everything else. The dinner was elk broth with dried onion and a handful of cornmeal stirred in to thicken it, which was not a meal Caleb would have served anyone by choice. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and they ate without talking for the first several minutes the way people do when they're both turning something large over in their minds and need the small, ordinary act of eating to keep them from saying things before they're ready. Eliza ate with her head slightly down and her eyes moving around the table surface, not focusing on anything in particular. He watched her the way he watched the tree line, peripherally, cataloging without appearing to. She'd said her name was Hargrove. She'd said her father owned Hargrove Continental. Both of those things Caleb believed without much difficulty. They explained the coat, the hands, the practiced quality of her movements, the way she observed everything and filed it. What he was still working on was the distance between who she clearly was and the story she'd given him initially, and not in a way that made him distrust her exactly. More in the way that made him understand the gap was protective. A woman in her situation, heiress to a contested fortune being hunted across Montana territory in January, couldn't afford to trust on instinct alone. The fact that she'd told him the truth at all meant something. "How long were you running before the horse threw you?" he asked. She looked up. 3 days? "From where?" "A town called Belford, about 60 miles northeast of here. I had a room there, at a boarding house. I'd been there almost 2 weeks trying to work out the next step." She set her spoon down. 2 of Crane's men came to the boarding house. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Pryor, she told them she had no guests, which was kind of her, but it bought me maybe an hour. I took the horse from the stable behind the hotel and went west. It was the only direction without a road they could follow easily. "The horse wasn't yours." "No, I left money for it in the stable." Something crossed her face, the ghost of wry humor that wasn't quite comfortable yet. "I've been leaving money in a lot of places I shouldn't be." "And the missing boot?" "The horse went down on ice crossing a creek. I went into the water, maybe shoulder deep before I got clear. The boot came off in the current, and I didn't find it." She paused. "I should have stopped then and tried to find shelter, but I was still moving on fear. I kept going." Caleb nodded slowly. Fear did that. Kept a person moving past the point of sense, past the point where sense would have said stop and rest and reassess. He'd seen it in animals, and he'd felt it in himself, that hard mechanical push that didn't consult reason. It wasn't stupidity that had gotten her onto that trail in a blizzard with one bare foot. It was 3 days of being hunted in the cold. How did Crane know where you were? He asked. Belford's not an obvious stop from... He paused. Where did you come from before that? After your father died? She folded her hands around her bowl. Helena, originally. That's where the main offices are. When my father died and the will was read, I had about 12 hours before things started happening that made it clear staying in Helena was going to become very difficult. She said it plainly, without melodrama, but he heard what was behind it, 12 hours in which she'd understood that her father was gone and simultaneously that the world his presence had kept in place around her was also gone, and she was alone in the middle of it. I went to Missoula. I had a contact there, an attorney who'd worked with my father. He was supposed to be helping me establish the legal standing to take control of the company. Supposed to be. He took money from Crane. The way she said it was flat, not angry, past anger, like she'd processed the betrayal far enough that it had become just a fact. I found out because he was too careful about certain things and not careful enough about others. I left Missoula before he could pass along my new address. After that, I moved around. Billings, a stop near Great Falls. Then Belford. And now here. And now here. She picked up her spoon again, then set it down again. I've been operating on the assumption that the further I got from the rail lines in the major towns, the harder I'd be to find. That's true up to a point. The problem is that out here, a woman traveling alone in winter is conspicuous in a different way. There are fewer places to disappear into. Caleb drained his bowl and set it aside. He thought about the maps he kept in his head. The territory, the routes, the towns that were real towns, and the ones that were just a trading post and a saloon and a post office on a good day. He thought about where Harlan's Creek sat in relation to all of it. Crane is based where? He asked. His primary offices are in Butte, but he travels. He's been in Harlan's Creek for at least 2 weeks. I had someone watching for movement, and they sent word before I left Belford. A pause. He knows I'm in this general area. He just doesn't know exactly where. Yet, she agreed. But they talked until the fire burned down to coals that needed banking, and the cold had crept in enough that both of them were sitting with their shoulders slightly drawn in toward warmth. Caleb got up twice to add wood. Eliza talked, and he listened, which was the dynamic that made sense. She had more to explain than he had to say, and he had the kind of attention that didn't interrupt things unnecessarily. The picture that emerged was complicated in the ways that money and family and power always complicated things, but the basic structure was simple enough. Arthur Hargrove had built his empire over 30 years from a land claim and a surveyor's eye and a willingness to work people hard, including himself. He'd had one wife, who had died when Eliza was 7. He'd had no sons. He'd raised his daughter with a strange combination of exclusion and preparation. Kept her out of the actual operations of the company, shielded her from the mechanics of how the money was made and held, but also educated her far past what was expected, made sure she knew how to read a contract and understand what a balance sheet was saying and when someone was lying to her. He never told me directly that I would inherit the controlling interest, she said. He never said it out loud. I think he thought that if he said it, I'd become a target before he was gone to protect me. She looked at the coals, which is either a calculated strategy or a failure of nerve, depending on how you look at it. Could be both. Yes, he was capable of both. There was something in her voice when she talked about her father, not uncomplicated grief, not straight resentment, something that had both in it and hadn't finished resolving itself. He prepared me and kept me blind at the same time. I know enough to hold the company. I don't know enough about what it cost to build it. And Crane? Aldous Crane has been a business associate of my father's for 12 years, not a partner. My father never gave him a formal partnership. Crane bought land and sold it to my father's rail operations at prices that were mutually beneficial, and my father gave him certain contracts and preferential positions. It was a working relationship built on self-interest. She paused. When my father got ill 2 years ago, Crane started positioning himself. I watched it happen. I didn't understand the full shape of it until the will was read and his name wasn't in it. What did he expect to get? Controlling interest, or at minimum a board seat and the operational authority that would come with it. She looked at Caleb directly. He'd been told, by someone close to my father, I don't know who, that the inheritance would be structured to go to the board. Standard practice for a company that size. When it went to me instead, he'd already spent 2 years building towards something he didn't get. So he decided to take it anyway. His first move was legal, an attempt to contest the will on grounds of my father's mental competency. That failed. My father had been meticulous about documenting his state of mind with witnesses over the last year of his life. Something like bleak admiration crossed her face. He knew Crane would try it. He prepared for it. She exhaled. The legal challenge bought Crane about 6 weeks and cost me the attorney in Missoula. After that, it became less legal. The bruise along her jaw. The horse thrown in a January creek. He sent men to pressure me directly. Twice in Helena, once in Missoula, once in Billings. She said it in the same flat cataloging voice she used for facts she'd processed past their emotional content. The one in Billings was the worst. Is that where the jaw came from? She touched it automatically, then stopped herself. Yes. Caleb said nothing. He looked at the coals. I'm not telling you this to get your sympathy, she said, a small hard edge coming into her voice. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you because you need to understand what Crane is willing to do. He's not a man who employs thugs as a last resort. He employs them as a first response and worries about the exposure afterward. I know what he is, Caleb said. I've known since I was 12 years old. She was quiet for a moment. What did he do to your family? He stood up from the table and went to the fire, banking the coals properly, settling them for the night. When he'd finished, he stayed with his back to her for a moment before he turned around. My father had land, he said. Not this land, further east in the Dakota Territory. Good grazing land, well-watered, positioned between 2 rail corridors that were both being extended northward. When the rail companies came looking, my father had something they needed. He came back to the table but didn't sit. Crane was functioning as an intermediary, buying up small holdings and selling them in packages to the rail companies at inflated prices. He approached my father twice about selling. My father said no twice. The third time he approached, he brought legal papers that suggested my father had already agreed to sell for a price he hadn't actually agreed to. Ian mocked. She was watching him carefully. The papers were fraudulent, Caleb said. My father knew it, but he was a homesteader with a grade school education, and Crane came with lawyers. The case dragged on for 2 years. My father won, technically. The fraudulent papers were thrown out. But the legal costs took most of what we had. He died the year after the case ended. He paused. Of nothing dramatic. Just a man who'd been ground down by years of fighting something he shouldn't have had to fight, and at some point his body got tired of it. Eliza was quiet, not with the polite quietness of someone waiting to respond. The real kind. I'm sorry, she said. It was 15 years ago. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter. He looked at her. She was saying it plainly, without the soft edge that people sometimes put on condolences to make themselves more comfortable in the giving of them. She meant it as a simple statement of fact. Time passing didn't make a thing less real. He found he didn't have any argument with that. No, he said. It doesn't. He gave her the back room again and took the floor in the main room, which was warmer than the back anyway, and didn't bother him. He'd slept on harder floors in worse conditions and could do it again without complaint. But he didn't sleep for a long time. He lay on his back in the dark with the coals giving the room a faint red-orange glow and thought about the shape of what he'd gotten himself into. Not what he was going to do about it. That was a question for the morning when his mind was cleaner, but just the shape of it. The fact that the woman he'd pulled out of a snowdrift was Eliza Hargrove, and that the man hunting her was Aldous Crane, and that those two things intersected with Caleb Rourke in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like something he didn't have a word for. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in signs, but he believed in the way certain things lined up when you weren't looking and in the quality of the feeling that came with it. Not comfort exactly, and not dread exactly. Something that felt like standing at a junction and knowing that both roads were visible, but the one you chose was going to be permanent. He thought about Crane's men in the tree line. He thought about the fact that Crane was in Harlan's Creek, 11 miles south, and that it was only a matter of time before someone made the connection to Caleb's name and property. He thought about the offer that would come when that connection was made, because it would be an offer, not a threat. That was how Crane operated. He started with the transaction and moved to force only when the transaction failed. He'd tried it with Caleb's father. He'd tried it with Eliza. It wouldn't work the same way with Caleb, but Crane didn't know that yet. He turned onto his side and tried to get comfortable against the floorboards, and thought about Eliza Hargrove sitting across the fire from him with her hands folded around a bowl of watery elk broth, explaining her situation with the same direct precision that a man would use, without softening it or apologizing for its complexity or looking at him the way some people looked at you when they needed something, with that particular species of hope that was really a form of pressure. She hadn't looked at him like that. She told him the facts and let him sit with them. He respected that more than he'd expected to. The morning was clear and cold, the sky that specific shade of winter blue that looked almost harsh in its clarity. Caleb was up before the light fully came in, had the fire built back up, and the coffee on before he heard her moving around in the back room. She came out dressed and her hair sorted into a braid that was neither neat nor messy, practical, just pulled back and secured. She poured coffee and sat at the table and didn't say good morning, which he found he didn't mind. Some people needed the pleasantries and some people could let the morning exist without narrating it. "I want to see what you found yesterday," she said after about 5 minutes. "The tracks." He looked at her. "You want to go outside and look at hoof prints in the snow?" "I want to understand the positions." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "If I'm going to think through the problem, I need the actual geography. I can't work from a description." He thought about arguing, then decided against it. She was right that geography mattered, and she was right that descriptions weren't the same thing, and the foot was healed enough that walking a half-mile wouldn't damage it, as long as she was careful. "After breakfast," he said. They ate oats this time, which were better than the broth, but not by a significant margin. And then she borrowed one of his older coats, a heavy canvas thing that came down past her knees on her smaller frame, and they went out into the morning. He took her to the tree line on the east approach and showed her where the horses had stood, the depressions in the snow, the way they'd positioned themselves to see the cabin without being visible from the windows. She crouched in the snow and looked at the tracks with an attention that was almost like a physical thing, something you could feel in the air around her. "2 horses, you said." "2. The tracks I found were both heading south, but one went east first and then swung back around." He pointed the direction. "Classic flanking watch, 1 man on each approach, both with a sight line to the front of the cabin." "Did they overlap their watch? Like, were they checking in with each other?" She stood up, her eyes following the line of the tracks. Hard to say from the prints alone, but the positioning suggests they knew each other's locations. She was quiet for a moment, scanning the tree line. The light came through the pines at an angle that caught the frost crystals in the upper branches and turned them white gold, and she stood in it without noticing it or commenting on it, which he found oddly interesting. She was the kind of person whose attention went to the relevant thing and stayed there. "He knows I'm within a day's radius of Harlan's Creek," she said. "The way they set up this watch means they were casting a wide net, checking multiple properties, not targeting this specific cabin, which means I haven't been directly located yet. I'm still in the general sweep." That's how I read it. How long before the sweep becomes specific? If they're methodical about it, a week to 10 days before they've covered the obvious properties in the area. After that, they start asking questions in Harlan's Creek about who lives out here, and that's when names come up. He paused. "My name comes up sooner if Crane already knows about the property. I bought it under my name, recorded at the county office in Harlan's Creek. Would Crane have looked at county records? He'd have had someone do it. Whether he connected Caleb Rourke to the Rourke family from Dakota Territory depends on what he remembers and what his people are thorough enough to look up." He watched her process this. "My guess is a week. Maybe less." She nodded, once, very precisely. They walked back toward the cabin in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The snow crunched under their feet and the cold was dry enough that their breath came out in clean white puffs, and somewhere up on the ridge a crow called twice and then was quiet. "What's in Harlan's Creek?" she asked, about halfway back. "How do you mean?" "Who's there? Is there a sheriff? A judge?" There's a sheriff, man named Purcell. Been there 5 years, mostly reliable. Handles the ordinary trouble competently. There's no resident judge. A circuit judge comes through every 8 weeks or so." He thought about it. "There's a telegraph office, a bank. The newspaper does a weekly edition. It's not a big town, but it's functional. Is Purcell corruptible? It was a blunt question, and she asked it bluntly without softening it into something more polite. He thought about Purcell, the man's particular combination of competence and practicality, the way he handled things that were above his pay grade. I don't know, he said honestly. I haven't had occasion to find out. He's not crooked in the ordinary way. Whether he bends under the kind of pressure Crane brings to bear, he paused. I genuinely don't know. That's useful, she said. Honest uncertainty is more useful than false confidence. He looked at her sideways. You're used to people telling you what you want to hear. I'm used to people telling me what they think will benefit them most. She said it without self-pity, just cataloging. It's a skill, learning to hear through it. My father taught me that, at least, even if he didn't teach me much else directly. They reached the cabin door, and she stopped with her hand on the latch. Caleb. She used his name the way she had the other day, direct, without social padding. What Crane did to your family, is that why you're not going to turn me over to him? He looked at her. It was a direct question that deserved a direct answer. That's part of it, he said. What's the other part? He thought about how to say it honestly without overstating it, which was a thing he cared about. The difference between what was true and what sounded true. You're here, he said finally, and I don't let people get hurt on my property if I can prevent it. She looked at him for a moment with those dark pine eyes, reading something in that. Then she opened the door and went inside, and he followed her, and neither of them said anything else about it. 3 more days passed. Caleb rode out daily. Short circuits, an hour or two each time, checking the approaches, looking for new tracks, watching for anything that moved at the margins. He found nothing more in the immediate vicinity. Whatever Crane's men were doing, they'd moved their operation back toward the main routes and hadn't returned to the east tree line. That could mean they'd dismissed this property as a possibility. It could also mean they'd gotten more specific information and were coming back with a different approach. He didn't know which, and not knowing was its own kind of tension. Inside the cabin, something was shifting in the quality of the time they spent together. Not dramatically, not in ways that Caleb could have pointed to in a single moment, but in the accumulation of details. She started helping with the morning routine without being asked, which he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was that she started asking questions about the operation. The cattle, the trap lines, the arrangements he had with the logging outfits. Not in a probing way, in the way of someone who was genuinely curious about how a thing worked. How do you manage the cattle through winter without a full crew? She asked one afternoon. She was sitting at the table with his ledger open in front of her. He'd handed it to her when she'd asked to look at the numbers. Not particularly comfortable with the exposure, but seeing no reason to refuse. 40 head in terrain like this, in temperatures like this. They're hardy stock. Montana Longhorn crosses, not the breeds you'd find further south. I built the shelter to take advantage of the natural windbreak on the south face of the rock formation. He glanced at the ledger. What are you looking at? Your hay cost is high relative to what you're selling the cattle for. I know, I haven't found a buyer who'll pay what they're worth. Have you approached the operations further north? The logging outfits need beef the same as everyone else, and they're paying premium prices because the supply lines are harder. He looked at her. That's not a bad idea. I didn't say it was. She said it matter-of-factly, without the false modesty that would have meant something different. The numbers work if you can get 40 cents more per hundredweight, and you move the whole herd at once, rather than in pieces. You looked at that in the 5 minutes you've had the ledger. I look at numbers quickly. My father's one useful direct lesson. She ran a finger down a column of figures. You've been operating on a margin that doesn't leave you much room. One bad winter. I know. She looked up. I'm not criticizing the management. I'm saying the operation is fundamentally sound. The margin problem is a market problem, not a cost problem. She paused. There's a difference. There is, he agreed. He was looking at her in a way he hadn't intended to be obvious about, and she caught it. What? Nothing. You're good at it. At reading ledgers? At seeing the shape of a problem quickly. Something shifted in her face. Not quite pleasure, not quite surprise. Like being told a thing was true that she knew was true, but hadn't expected anyone else to notice. She looked back down at the ledger. I had a lot of practice working things out on my own, she said. When you can't ask anyone directly, You get very good at working from the numbers you can find. He thought about what she'd said the night they talked, about being prepared and kept blind at the same time. A man who'd educated his daughter while keeping her out of the room where the decisions were made. She'd made up the difference in the only way available to her, quietly, on her own, with whatever she could get her hands on. "The company," he said, "Hargrove Continental. Do you actually know how to run it?" She didn't answer immediately. He appreciated that, the fact that she sat with the question instead of deflecting it. The administrative side, yes. The legal structure, the financial instruments, the contracts. I understand those. The operational side, she paused. Less. I know what the operations are and how they fit together. I don't have the day-to-day knowledge that comes from being in the offices and on the lines for years. She looked up. But no one starts knowing everything. The difference between me and the men who think they should be running it is that I know what I don't know, and they've convinced themselves they know everything they need to. Caleb thought about that for a moment, then, "That's probably an advantage." "It is," she said simply. "If I can ever get to the position of actually running it," which was the thing sitting at the center of all of it, the thing they'd been working around for days, what she was going to do. She couldn't run to Harlan's Creek. Crane was there. She couldn't stay hidden in the Bitterroot foothills indefinitely. Crane was closing the search. She needed a move, and the moves available to her were limited by the fact that she was a woman alone in hostile territory without access to her financial resources, and with a compromised legal representative and an enemy who had already demonstrated he was willing to use physical force. It was not a comfortable set of constraints. They talked about it in pieces, not all at once, over those 3 days. Not with the urgency of a plan that needed to be made today, but with the careful circling of people who are each used to thinking things through independently and are learning to think something through together. She had names, people in Helena who'd been loyal to her father who might still be reachable through back channels. A second attorney, not the one in Missoula, someone her father had used for personal matters rather than company matters, who had no financial connection to Crane as far as she knew. A contact at the telegraph office in Billings who had passed word to her before. He had geography, the routes, the timing, the way the territory worked in winter. He knew which roads Crane's men would watch and which they'd consider too slow to bother with. He knew who in Harlan's Creek was worth talking to and who wasn't, and more importantly, who talked and who could be trusted to keep quiet. On the third day, he told her about the thing he hadn't told her yet. "My father left papers," he said. He was mending a piece of tack at the table and she was across from him, writing something again in the close, careful hand he'd come to recognize. From the land case, the correspondence between Crane and the people he used to manufacture the fraud. My father kept everything. He was meticulous about it, maybe more meticulous than was reasonable for a man in his situation, but he kept every letter, every document, every note. She looked up from her writing. "I have them," Caleb said, "in a box in the back room. I've had them since he died. I kept them because I thought someday there might be a use for them, and also because throwing them away seemed like losing the last evidence that the whole thing had actually happened and hadn't just been a man getting ground down by bad luck." She was very still. "What do the papers show?" "The fraud, clearly, which isn't new. It was proven in court. But there are also letters between Crane and 2 men I didn't recognize at the time who I've since identified as a county recorder in Dakota Territory who altered records on Crane's behalf, and a territorial judge who was supposed to hear the appeal if the first judgment went the wrong way." He looked at her steadily. "Prearranged corruption, an insurance policy. If my father had lost the first case, the appeal would have gone to a Judge Crane already owned." "So, Montamt." Eliza set down her pen. "The names are in the letters?" "Written in Crane's own hand and in the letters back to him." She was quiet for a moment, something moving rapidly behind her eyes. "That's not just evidence of what he did to your father. That's a pattern. Documented fraud and judicial corruption across multiple cases. If there are other instances, if a man was willing to do it to a homesteader in Dakota Territory in 1872, he was willing to do it again." "Yes." She was already somewhere else in her thinking. He could see it, her eyes focused on nothing in the room, working through connections and implications. "He's been building land positions for 20 years. If there are other fraudulent purchases in his portfolio, other cases where documents were altered or judges were paid." She stopped. Then carefully, "Can I look at them, the papers?" Caleb stood up and went to the back room. The box was in the corner behind his spare blankets. A wooden crate. Not particularly distinguished, the kind of thing that looked like it might hold nails or spare hardware. He carried it back out to the table and set it in front of her. She opened it slowly, the way you open something that held more than its container suggested. He watched her face as she read the first letter, then the second. The careful, controlled expression was still there, but under it something was building. Not excitement exactly, more like the feeling of seeing a thing take shape that you'd been trying to see for a long time. "Caleb," she said quietly without looking up. "Yeah. This changes things." "I thought it might." She finally looked up from the papers. Her eyes were sharp and very clear, and behind them was the mind that had been sitting in that chair for days working on the problem from every angle she could find. She wasn't afraid in that moment. She was thinking, fully and without the weight of the fear sitting on top of it, and it changed her face in a way he hadn't seen before. "I need to get word to the attorney in Helena," she said. "The personal one. I need to do it without using Harlan's Creek's telegraph. Billings has a second telegraph office, 2 days' ride. Can we do it without being seen?" He looked at her. Something settled in his chest. Not a decision, exactly, because the decision had been made already, maybe even before he'd climbed down from Ghost's back in that snowfield, but the acknowledgement of it, the moment when it became real and specific rather than theoretical. "There's a route through the northern pass," he said. "It's harder riding in winter, but it avoids the main roads. We could reach Billings in 2.5 days if the weather holds." She looked at him for a moment, then, "You'd do that." "I said I would, didn't I?" "You said you wouldn't let people get hurt on your property." A pause. "Billings is considerably farther than your property." "I expanded the definition," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, then looked back down at the papers in the box, her finger tracing the edge of one document without quite touching it. "We'd need supplies for 5 days in case of weather delays," she said. "I can have them ready by morning." "And the cattle?" He thought about it. "My nearest neighbor is a man named Hadley, 4 miles east. He owes me labor. I can stop there on the way out and ask him to check the shelter every other day." She nodded, working through the logistics the way she worked through the numbers in the ledger. Quickly, methodically, with an eye for the thing you might have missed. "What about Crane's men, if they come back to check the property while we're gone?" "Empty cabin tells them I'm traveling, which I do periodically. There's nothing here that connects you to me." She paused. "Your ledger, the supplies, the ratio is off for one person." He looked at her. She was right. The amount of food he'd used in the last 2 weeks was more than a single man's consumption, and a careful observer going through his cabin would notice the numbers didn't add up. "I'll take the ledger," he said. "And the box," she said, touching the edge of the crate with her fingertips. "Everything in this box comes with us." "That was already my intention." She looked up again, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the fire was burning and the wind was at the window, and outside the Montana territory was cold and complicated and full of things that were trying to grind them both down in different ways. But in the cabin, in that specific moment, what existed was the beginning of a plan, and 2 people sitting across a table from each other who had decided, separately and together, that they weren't going to let that happen. "Get some sleep," he said. "We leave before first light." She nodded and started rereading the letters in the box, and he went to bank the fire for the night. They left before the sky had finished deciding whether it was night or morning, that particular gray hour when the stars were still faintly visible, but the horizon had begun to separate itself from the land. Caleb had the horses ready in the dark, Ghost and a sturdy brown mare named Hatch that he used for heavy hauling and who had the temperament for difficult trail conditions. He'd packed the saddlebags the night before. 5 days of food, ammunition, the wooden crate wrapped in oilcloth and secured to Hatch's pack frame, his father's papers inside it. Eliza came out of the cabin dressed in the heaviest layers he could lend her, a second wool shirt under the canvas coat, a pair of his riding trousers that she'd belted tight and folded up at the ankle, proper boots borrowed from the box he kept in the lean-to where he stored things that might eventually be useful. They were a size too large, but stuffed with wool they held well enough. She'd looked at herself once in the small mirror above the basin and made no comment about what she saw, which he noted. She mounted Hatch without assistance and without ceremony. They rode north first into the high country before swinging east. The northern pass Caleb had described was not a comfortable route under any conditions, and in January it was actively punishing. The trail was narrow enough in places that they rode single file with the rock face close enough to touch on one side and a drop on the other that the snow made impossible to read properly. And the wind came through the gap in the rock formations with a compressed force that was different from the open country wind, sharper and more personal about it. But it was clear of other travelers. It was always clear of other travelers in January, which was the point. They didn't talk much in the first hours. The terrain demanded attention, and the cold demanded that you keep your face turned away from the wind when possible, which left conversation to the occasional practical exchange. A warning about ice on a particular section of trail, a question about which fork to take at a junction where the snow had obscured the obvious choice. Caleb led and Eliza followed, and behind them the cabin and the 11 miles to Harlan's Creek and Aldous Crane shrank back into the white landscape and temporarily ceased to be the immediate problem. The immediate problem was the pass. They cleared it by mid-afternoon, and the terrain opened up on the eastern side into a long rolling plateau that was easier going but more exposed to the sky, which had been building clouds since noon in the way that made Caleb's weather sense pull tight at the back of his mind. Not a storm yet, but the potential for one, somewhere in the next day or two. He pushed the pace on the plateau. They made camp that night in a draw that offered shelter from the wind, and ate cold food because building a fire on the open plateau was an advertisement Caleb didn't want to put out, and slept in their bedrolls close enough to the horses for warmth. Eliza slept without complaint, which surprised him a little. He'd expected the discomfort of hard ground and cold air, and no privacy to register more than it appeared to. "You've slept outside before," he said in the morning, not really framing it as a question. She looked up from the business of rolling her bedroll. "I spent a month in a sheep camp in Idaho when I was 17. My father sent me with a land survey team as a clerk." She tied off the roll with quick, practiced motions. He thought it would be educational. He was right, though not in the way he intended. "What did you learn?" She considered it. That the men doing the actual work knew things the men in the offices didn't, and that the offices didn't particularly want to know what the men in the field knew, and that sheep are more aggressive than their reputation suggests. He found himself close to something like a genuine laugh, which was not a sensation he was particularly familiar with. He turned to check Ghost's cinch and let it pass. They reached the outskirts of Billings on the afternoon of the third day, having lost a half day to a stretch of ice that had forced them to lead the horses on foot for 2 miles along a creek bed. The city, and it was a city by territory standards, considerably larger than Harlan's Creek, was still visible in the slant of late afternoon light when they came down out of the hills to the east, spread out along the river with its collection of brick and frame buildings, its rail yard to the north, its smoke from a dozen chimneys rising straight up in the cold, clear air. Caleb chose a boarding house on the eastern edge of town, away from the main commercial streets, the kind of place that asked no questions and kept no ledger available for public inspection. He paid for 2 rooms with the cash he'd brought and told the woman at the desk they were brother and sister, traveling to meet family, which was a lie with no particular artistry to it, but which the woman accepted with the practical indifference of someone who'd heard worse. Eliza went to her room, and he went to his, and they agreed to meet in an hour. He used the hour to walk the main street once, slowly, buying nothing, talking to no one except to ask the price of tobacco at the general store, which he didn't buy either. He was looking for anything that felt wrong, a configuration of men, a particular quality of attention. The town moved around him at its ordinary pace. Freight wagons, a cluster of men outside the saloon, 2 women picking through bolts of fabric in the dry goods window. Nothing that made the prickle rise at the back of his neck. When he got back, Eliza was already dressed again and ready, and they went to the telegraph office together. The contact she'd mentioned, the operator in Billings who'd passed word to her before, was not on duty. The young man at the key told them the regular operator was ill, had been for a week. She stood at the counter for a moment with that specific stillness she had, and he could see her recalibrating. Then she sent the telegram anyway, addressed to her attorney in Helena with the name her father had used for him in letters, a family nickname that would identify her without using her actual name to the attorney, while meaning nothing to anyone who read the message on its way through. "He'll understand it," she said, as they came back out into the cold. "How sure are you of him?" He has no connection to Crane's money that I can find, and he handled my father's personal estate paperwork for 12 years without a single problem. A pause. He's also the only one left. They stopped at a general store for supplies to replenish what they'd used on the trail, and it was there, while Caleb was pricing ammunition and Eliza was at the other end of the counter looking at maps, that a man came in who changed the temperature of the room. He was large, not tall, but built with a heaviness across the shoulders that took up space beyond his physical dimensions. He had a flat, careful face, the kind that didn't show much by default and showed even less by practice. He wore a coat that was good quality but not distinctive, and he walked to the counter with the particular movement of someone who was used to moving through spaces and noting what was in them. Caleb kept his eyes on the ammunition in front of him and extended his peripheral attention the way you did when something in the room shifted. The man bought tobacco. He spoke to the clerk in a low voice for a moment about something Caleb couldn't hear. Then he looked around the store with the slow, unhurried quality of a man whose professional habit was to inventory his surroundings. His gaze moved over Caleb, passed on, moved to Eliza at the far end of the counter. It stopped, not obviously. A person watching casually would have seen nothing. But Caleb was not watching casually, and what he saw was the cessation of normal movement, the tiny reset of attention that happened when a person saw something they were looking for. "Eliza," he said conversationally, as if finishing a sentence she couldn't have heard. "Did you decide on the coffee?" She looked up from the map. She had no idea what he was talking about, and her face started to show it. But something in his tone reached her, and instead she said, "I'll get the smaller bag," and came toward him down the counter. She passed close enough that he could speak quietly. "The man by the door. Don't look at him. Pay for the goods and walk out. Walk normally." Her stride didn't change. She took the items from the counter and paid the clerk with the small amount of cash she was carrying and thanked him politely and walked out. Caleb took his time. He bought the ammunition, made a small exchange with the clerk about the weather, walked out at the pace of a man who had nothing pressing. On the street, he caught up to her without hurrying. "Keep walking. Don't go back to the boarding house yet." "He recognized me," she said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know that. He might have just been doing a visual survey, but his attention changed when he saw you." He kept them moving east, away from the main street. "You've been seen in Billings before, by Crane's people?" "Once. In October, early on, before I understood the extent of the search." "Then it's possible he recognized you from a description or a photograph." They went east for 2 blocks, then turned north, then waited in the gap between 2 buildings for 5 minutes. No one followed. The street behind them moved normally. "If he recognized me," Eliza said, her voice low and even, "and he sends word to Crane, then Crane knows you're in Billings." "Yes." Caleb leaned against the building and looked at the street. "But Billings is a big city. If we move quickly and don't state a pattern, he can know you're here without knowing specifically where." She was quiet for a moment. "How quickly can we leave?" "Tonight, if we push." She looked at the strip of sky visible between the buildings. The sun was already low, the light going orange and thin. Leaving tonight meant riding in the dark, which was hard riding on unfamiliar roads, and the temperature would drop hard after sundown. "All right," she said. They went back to the boarding house by a different route, collected their things, left a note explaining a family emergency, and were out of Billings on the western road before the last light died. Well, Caleb pushed them harder on the return journey, taking the main road for the first 20 miles where the trail was clear and fast before cutting north toward the pass again. The cold was serious, and he stopped twice to check Eliza's hands and feet and make sure the circulation was holding. She submitted to this with the patience of someone who understood the stakes and had decided to be practical about her own limitations, and didn't complain. She was tired. He could see it in the way she sat the horse after the first day, slightly forward and closer to the pommel than was technically correct, her body borrowing energy from the saddle that her muscles weren't giving freely anymore. She didn't say anything about it. They made camp on the second night at the edge of a creek in a thick stand of cottonwood that offered shelter and fuel, and he built a small fire this time. They were far enough from the main roads that the risk was acceptable, and the cold had become a serious consideration. She sat by it and held her hands toward the heat and didn't say anything for about 10 minutes. Then, "I keep thinking about that man in the store. You think he recognized you. I think the way you reacted to his attention was not the reaction of someone who thought it was nothing. She looked at the fire. You're not someone who reacts to nothing. No, he agreed. So he likely recognized me, which means Crane knows I'm in this area, possibly knows I was in Billings, and has now been looking for me long enough that he might have guessed at the connection to the Rourke property. She was working through it out loud, not performing the reasoning but actually doing it, letting it go where it went. When we get back, what are we walking into? I don't know, he said. Which is the problem? She was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped and sent a small shower of sparks up, and then they died. He's going to approach you, she said. I expect so. Before or after we get back? Depends how quickly the connection from Billings runs back to Harlan's Creek. He thought about the logistics of it. A telegram gets there in hours. A man writing gets there in 2 days. If the man in the store sent word tonight, Crane could know about it by morning. And reach your property by day after tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow night if he pushes. She looked at him steadily. And when he comes, he'll offer you money. Yes. How much do you think, based on what you know about how he operates? The question was practical, analytical, exactly the kind of thing she'd ask about a numbers problem. He found it steadying, actually. The fact that she was thinking about it in terms of strategy rather than waiting to see what happened. More than I've made in 2 years, he said. Possibly 3. He'll make it generous enough to feel like a real choice. And if you refuse, then he'll make it unpleasant. He looked at her directly. He'll have something by then, or he'll manufacture something. A debt I supposedly owe, a legal problem with the property, some leverage he can use to make the alternative to cooperation look worse than it is. He paused. That's how he works. He did it with my father's case. The initial fraudulent papers weren't the whole of it. He had a backup plan and a backup plan behind that. He layers the pressure. She was very still, listening. What he won't expect, Caleb said, is that I already know who he is in detail. He'll assume I know the name and the general reputation. He won't know that I've spent 15 years thinking about how that man operates. Something shifted in her expression. You've been thinking about him for 15 years? He looked at the fire. Not constantly, but when I had a problem to solve, I thought about how a man like that would approach it. It was informative. He paused. Useful preparation for a situation I didn't know I was going to need it for. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not afraid of him? I didn't say that. No, but you're not. She said it like she was deciding something. Most people become afraid when they've been thinking about a threat for a long time. It grows in their imagination. But you're the opposite. You've been thinking about him so long he's gotten smaller, more knowable. He turned that over. It wasn't wrong. He had thought about Aldous Crane over 15 years with the methodical attention you gave to a problem you intended eventually to solve. And what had happened was not that Crane had grown into a monster, but that he'd become a pattern, predictable in his methods, limited by the same forces that limited any man. Beatable if you understood the structure of how he beat other people. He operates on the assumption that everyone has a price, Caleb said. Every single person. He's not cynical about it in the way some people are cynical. He genuinely believes it, the way some men genuinely believe the sun comes up because they get out of bed. He's never been wrong often enough to learn otherwise. He looked at her. When he meets someone who doesn't have a price, he doesn't know how to read it at first. It looks like they haven't been offered enough. Which gives you a window, she said slowly. A short one. But yes. She was quiet for a moment, staring at the coals that were building at the base of the fire. Then, what do you want to happen at the end of all of this? He looked at her. What do you mean? I mean, she stopped, gathered it. You didn't ask to be involved in this. You found me in the snow and everything followed from that. I want to know what outcome you're working toward. For yourself. Not for me, not in the abstract. For you. It was the most direct thing she'd asked him. More direct than the question about Crane, more direct than the question about his family. He sat with it for a moment. I want Crane to lose, he said. Not the way he lost my father's case. Not a technical win that costs everything. I want him to lose in a way that sticks, that takes away what he's been building. He paused. And I want you to be able to do what your father intended, or what you intend, with what he left you. She looked at him steadily. Those aren't things you get something out of directly. No. Then why? He thought about the honest answer to that, the one that didn't make it more elegant than it was. Because I'm already in it, he said, and because the alternative is to let a man like that go on operating, and I've spent 15 years watching what that costs people. He looked at the fire. And because you're not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know, someone different. He glanced at her briefly. Someone who needed more protecting and less partnering. She held his gaze for a moment. The fire put light on the side of her face, and the darkness held the rest of it. And she was tired and trail-worn, and her hair had mostly escaped the braid, and she was looking at him with an expression that was clearer than anything he'd seen from her since the snowdrift. Not the controlled face, or the calculating face, or the afraid face. Just her, sitting by a fire in the cottonwoods. All right, she said quietly. All right what? All right, we're partners. She said it simply, without dramatics. I want to be clear about that. Not you protecting me and me being grateful. Not you making decisions and me implementing them. Partners. He looked at her. I wasn't planning it any other way. Good. She lay back on her bedroll and looked up at the stars visible between the cottonwood branches. Get some sleep. We need to be moving before first light. They came back to the cabin on the afternoon of the 4th day, coming in from the north the way they'd left. From the ridge above the property, Caleb stopped Ghost and spent several minutes looking at the cabin, the approaches, the lean-to. Everything looked undisturbed. No tracks in the fresh snow that had fallen the previous night, no smoke from the chimney that he hadn't made himself. They went down. Hadley, the neighbor 4 miles east, had checked the cattle as promised. There was a note on the cabin door in his blocky handwriting saying all was well, and that he'd need that labor repaid by spring, which was fair. Caleb tucked the note in his coat. Inside, everything was as they'd left it. He built the fire up while Eliza sorted through the things from the trip, hanging the damp gear, organizing what needed to go back in storage. She moved around the cabin with a familiarity that had accrued over the days they'd spent there together, and he noticed it without comment. It had stopped feeling like a stranger's movements. They ate a real meal that night, the last of the dried venison cooked with onion and the beans she'd soaked overnight before they left, which she'd left covered in a cold pot, and which were fine. He ate 2 full bowls, and she ate 1.5, and neither of them said much while they ate, comfortable with the quiet. After dinner, she spread the papers from the crate across the table and went back to studying them. He watched her for a while, the way her finger moved across the pages, the slight movement of her lips when she hit something that needed decoding, the occasional pause when she found something that mattered and held it. How long before the attorney in Helena responds to the telegram? He asked. If he got it today, he could reply by tomorrow morning. If there are complications... She shook her head. Honestly, I don't know. I've never had to communicate with him at this remove with this level of indirection. If we don't hear in 3 days, then I'll try another channel. There's a woman in Helena, a colleague of my father's from early in his career who I trust more than almost anyone else. I've been afraid to contact her directly because of the exposure, but if the attorney is unreachable... She stopped. We'll cross that when we get there. He nodded. They were still sitting at the table, her with the papers and him with a piece of leather he was working on, when the sound came. He heard it before she did. Hoofbeats on the south trail, moving at a deliberate pace, the sound of more than 1 horse, but not more than 3. He was on his feet before she looked up. Stay in the back room, he said quietly. Caleb, I need to know who it is before they know you're here. He was already moving, pulling his coat from the hook. If it's Crane or Crane's people, we need the advantage of them not knowing your location. Please. She held his gaze for a half second. He could see the push and pull of it in her face, the instinct against being put in a passive position warring with the understanding that he was right. Then she gathered the papers from the table and went to the back room without another word. He went outside. The riders came up the south approach and stopped at the edge of the yard, where the lantern light from the cabin window reached them. 3 horses, 3 men, which confirmed it was not a casual social call. The man in front was not one of the ones Caleb had tracked in the tree line. He was older, with the composed, unhurried quality of someone who didn't need to rush because other people rushed for him. He was dressed well, in a coat that cost more than most men in the territory earned in a month, and he had a face that was, after 15 years, recognizable. heavier, more settled into itself, but the same. Aldous Crane looked down from his horse at the man standing in the cabin doorway and said pleasantly, "Caleb Rourke, you've come a long way from Dakota." Caleb stood in the doorway with his hands loose at his sides and looked at the man his father had died fighting and felt the thing he'd expected to feel. The cold, specific quality of a held-off reckoning arriving at last with its luggage. "Mr. Crane," he said, "it's late to be riding." "It is," Crane agreed. He swung down from his horse with the ease of a man who'd been riding most of his adult life. His men stayed mounted. "I hoped we might talk. I have a proposition that I think would be worth your time." "All right," Caleb said. "Come in then." He stepped back from the door and let Aldous Crane into his home, and the two men who'd come with him stayed outside with the horses, and the door closed, and the fire was burning, and the table was clear of papers, and the back room door was closed. Crane looked around the cabin with the measuring attention of someone who was calculating values automatically. The work that had gone into the construction, the quality of the materials, the smallness of it relative to the land. His expression didn't change, but Caleb could read the calculation anyway. He'd watched men do it all his life. "Sit," Caleb said, not as a courtesy, but as a positioning decision. He wanted Crane in the chair that had its back to the window, and he wanted himself between Crane and the back room door. Crane sat. He folded his coat over the back of the chair and placed his hat on the table, and he looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who was about to conduct a business meeting and expected it to go his way. "I'll be direct," Crane said. "I'm looking for a woman, dark-haired, late 20s, maybe traveling under the name Ward or one of several other names. She was seen in Billings 4 days ago." He watched Caleb's face as he said it. "I have reason to believe she's been in this area." Caleb looked at him. He let the silence sit for a beat. Not a guilty beat, not an uncomfortable beat, just a man thinking. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description," he said. Crane smiled. It was a comfortable smile, patient and completely empty. "I didn't expect you had. Let me be more specific about why I'm asking." He settled back in the chair. "The woman I'm describing is Eliza Hargrove, daughter of the late Arthur Hargrove. You may know the name." "I know the name. She's currently involved in a dispute over her father's estate that has legal complications. I'm functioning in an advisory capacity to the board of Hargrove Continental, and I'm trying to locate Miss Hargrove to ensure she receives proper legal representation." He said it with the fluency of a man who'd said it many times, the smooth surface of the language, a professional finish over whatever the structure underneath was. "It's a welfare concern as much as a legal one. She's been traveling alone in difficult conditions, and there are people who care about her well-being." Caleb said nothing. "Now." Crane leaned forward slightly. "I know who you are, Caleb. I knew your father. I understand there's history between our families that wasn't pleasant. I want to address that directly. I have no interest in revisiting old conflicts. I'd like to make a clean start." He named a number. It was, as Caleb had predicted, more than 2 years' earnings. "For information about Miss Hargrove's whereabouts, if you've seen her, spoken to anyone who has, noticed anything unusual in the last several weeks, that's all I'm asking." "Ishan." The fire crackled. A log shifted. Caleb looked at Aldous Crane and thought about his father sitting in a chair that looked something like this one, in a house that no longer existed, with papers in front of him that were lies, and a man across the table from him who wore the same expression. That comfortable patience of someone who believed the outcome was already settled and was just waiting for the other person to understand it. "That's a generous offer," Caleb said. "I think so." Crane's expression was pleasant, certain. "I haven't seen the woman you're describing," Caleb said. "I haven't spoken to anyone who has. I haven't noticed anything unusual." A pause. The smile didn't leave Crane's face, but the certainty behind it adjusted, recalibrated. "I see," Crane said. "If I do see anything," Caleb said, "I'll let the sheriff in Harlan's Creek know. That seems like the appropriate channel for a welfare concern." The smile thinned. It didn't disappear. This was a man with more control than that, but it became a different thing. The patience behind it became a different kind of patience, the kind that was deciding what to do next. "I hope you'll reconsider," Crane said. "There's significant legal jeopardy attached to anyone who might be sheltering a person involved in a contested inheritance proceeding, harboring in certain interpretations of territorial law. I'll keep that in mind, Caleb said. Crane looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the table and stood. I'm staying at the Harlan's Creek Hotel for the foreseeable future, he said. If your memory improves, the offer remains open. I'll remember that. At the door, Crane paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at Caleb. You look like your father, he said, more than I expected. Something in his voice that wasn't quite anything. Not regret, not threat. Something that lived in between them, in the dark space where a man showed the edges of what he actually was. He was a difficult man to do business with. He was an honest man, Caleb said. Crane held his gaze for another beat, then went out into the dark. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched the 3 horses move away down the south trail until they disappeared, and then he stood for another minute in the cold, in the dark, in the absolute quiet of the Montana night, and let himself feel the thing he'd been compressing since the moment he heard the hoofbeats. He was shaking, barely, just the fine tremor in his hands that happened when something held tightly finally got to loosen. He pressed his hands flat against the doorframe and waited until it passed. Then he went back inside. Eliza was standing in the back room doorway. She had the papers in her arms, pressed against her chest, and her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. You heard, he said. Everything. Her voice was quiet. Caleb, I know. He went to the fire and stood with his back to it, facing her. He's going to come back. Not tonight. He'll let it sit for a day, give the threat about the legal jeopardy time to work on me. When it doesn't, he'll do something else. She walked to the table and set the papers down carefully. He knows you're not going to take the money. He suspects it. He doesn't know it yet. There's a difference. He'll still try the money twice more before he accepts it's not going to work. He looked at her. But the timeline has shortened. He's here in person, which means he considers this a priority. We have days, not weeks. She looked at the papers on the table. Her jaw was set, the way it got when she was working through something difficult and hadn't reached the other side of it yet. The attorney and Helena, she said. If we hear from him tomorrow, we need to be ready to move fast. He sat down at the table. Tell me what you need from him, specifically. What's the minimum that changes the situation? She sat down across from him. Outside, the horses were long gone south, and the night was quiet again, and the fire was burning steadily, and Aldous Crane was 11 miles away in a hotel room, probably making his own calculations about timelines and next moves. And Caleb Rourke and Eliza Hargrove sat at a small table in a small cabin and started working out how to beat him. The reply from Helena came the next afternoon. Caleb had ridden to Harlan's Creek that morning, alone, without Eliza, who had agreed to stay at the cabin with the door barred and the rifle accessible and explicit instructions about what to do if anyone came up the south trail before he got back. He didn't like leaving her. She didn't like being left. Neither of them said either of those things directly. They just moved through the logistics with the shared understanding that this was what the situation required. He went to Harlan's Creek because he needed to know what Crane was doing from ground level and because he needed to talk to the telegraph operator, a man named Greer who had been at the Harlan's Creek office for 11 years and who Caleb had done occasional small favors for, the kind that accumulated into something usable over time. He also needed to understand what Sheriff Purcell knew and what he'd been told. The town felt different. Not dramatically, nothing that would have alarmed a casual visitor. But Caleb had been coming here for 8 years, and he knew the ordinary texture of the place, the way the people moved and talked and configured themselves on the street, and something in that texture had shifted. There were 2 men outside the hotel he didn't recognize, the kind of men who stood in a way that suggested their job was to stand and watch. The saloon had more horses outside it than the day of the week warranted. At the hardware store, the owner, a man named Briggs, who was normally chatty to the point of inconvenience, gave Caleb his goods with a minimum of conversation and eyes that moved to the street twice while they talked. Money had come to Harlan's Creek. Not good money, the kind that made people careful and quiet. At the telegraph office, Greer was behind his key with the look of a man who wanted to say things he wasn't certain were safe to say. Caleb leaned on the counter and kept his voice low and asked if there were any messages in the box under R. There were 2, and the fact that there were 2 when he'd only expected one was interesting. He took them and paid for a reply and wrote it out in the careful shorthand that wouldn't mean anything to anyone who didn't know the context and handed it back to Greer. "Busy week," he said. "Unusually," Greer said, which told him everything he needed to know about Greer's current opinion of the situation. He went to find Purcell. The sheriff's office was at the north end of the main street, a narrow building that had the slightly temporary quality of a structure built when the town was smaller and never properly replaced. Purcell was at his desk when Caleb came in, a compact, weathered man in his mid-40s who had the default expression of someone permanently prepared to hear something he didn't want to deal with. He looked up at Caleb. "Rourke, Purcell." Caleb sat in the chair across the desk without being invited, which was within the acceptable range of their acquaintance. "What's happening in my town?" Purcell looked at him for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "A businessman named Aldous Crane arrived 6 days ago with a legal matter that involves a missing person, a woman related to some kind of inheritance dispute. He's been authorized by something, I'm not entirely clear on the chain of authority, to conduct a search in the area." He paused. "He came to see me on his second day here, told me about the woman, showed me a document that gives him some kind of legal standing to act in her best interests." "What kind of document?" "That's where it gets complicated." Purcell brought his eyes back down from the ceiling. "It's a temporary guardianship order. Claims the woman is mentally incapacitated and requires supervision by a family representative." Caleb was very still. "Her name is Hargrove," Purcell said. "Eliza Hargrove. And I don't know who she is or what the truth of the situation is, but I know what that document smells like. And it smells like something that was put together quickly by someone with money and a cooperative judge somewhere." He looked at Caleb directly. "I'm not a sophisticated man, Rourke, but I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a legitimate welfare concern and a legal mechanism being used as a hunting tool. But you haven't said that to Crane." "I haven't said it to Crane because that document, whatever I think of it, represents a legal authority I can't simply ignore without a countervailing order from someone with equivalent standing." He rubbed his face with both hands, a tired man's gesture, the gesture of someone carrying something heavier than it should have been. "If she's in this area, and if Crane finds her, that document gives him the right to take her into custody, and I can't stop him without risking my own legal standing and the town's." He paused. "Unless someone challenges the document in front of a judge." "The circuit judge. He's due in 12 days. A pause. "Which is longer than I suspect this situation is going to take to resolve itself." They looked at each other. "I'm not telling you anything," Purcell said carefully. "I'm just describing the legal landscape as I understand it." "I appreciate the description," Caleb said. He rode back to the cabin faster than he'd ridden south, and the cold came up around him on the trail, and he barely felt it. Eliza read both telegrams at the table while he stood by the fire. The first, from her attorney in Helena, a man named Forsyth, was longer, and she read it twice, her finger moving along the lines of the coded language slowly the second time, making sure she'd decoded it correctly. The second was shorter and had come from the woman she'd mentioned, the colleague of her father's in Helena. She read that one faster. When she'd finished both, she set them down and sat with her hands flat on the table in that way she had. The way that meant she was very controlled about something. "Forsyth says the guardianship order is real," she said. "He's seen the filing. It was pushed through a probate court in Butte 6 weeks ago using affidavits from 2 physicians who claim to have examined me." She said it flatly, without the emotion it deserved. "I have never met either of those physicians. Can it be challenged?" "Yes. But a challenge requires a counterfiling, a hearing, and a judge willing to hear it. The nearest sympathetic judge Forsyth can reach is in Helena." She looked up. "He says if I can get to Helena with the original documents, the will, the letters, everything, he can file a challenge that will at minimum freeze Crane's ability to act on the guardianship order while the challenge is heard. At minimum. The maximum is that the order gets thrown out entirely and Forsyth files for a temporary injunction against Crane's interference with the estate." She paused. "He says the letters from your father's case are potentially significant, more significant than I thought. He wants to see them." Helena is 4 days from here. 3.5 if we push. He looked at her. Crane's men are watching the main routes. I know. She tapped the second telegram. Margaret, my father's colleague, says Crane has 2 men posted at the rail station in Missoula. If we go east toward the rail corridor, we go through them. Then we don't go east. He crossed to the table and sat. We go north first, then come down into Helena from the Clark Fork Valley. It's longer, but it keeps us off the primary routes. She was already calculating. He could see it, the map unfolding in her head, measuring distances against time, against the weather. How long does that add? Half a day, maybe? We'd make it in 4 days total. Forsyth says the circuit judge is coming to Harlan's Creek in 12 days. That's not enough time to get to Helena, file, and get a hearing back here. No. She looked at the telegrams. But it might be enough time to get to Helena, file, and get a ruling that removes the guardianship order. And if that ruling arrives by telegram in Harlan's Creek before the circuit judge leaves, then there's no guardianship order for the circuit judge to act on, Caleb said slowly. And Crane's legal standing to conduct a search disappears. She pressed her lips together. It's tight. The timing is genuinely tight. What does the other telegram say? The woman? Margaret. Eliza's expression shifted. Something in it that was not quite pain and not quite gratitude. The face of someone who'd been alone in something for a long time and had just found out they weren't as alone in it as they thought. She's been gathering information in Helena since my father died, Eliza said quietly, without me asking her to. She says she has documentation of 3 other land acquisitions by Crane over the past decade that show the same pattern as your father's case. Fraudulent transfer documents, altered county records, in one case a forged signature on a federal land grant. She set the telegram down carefully. She's been holding it. She didn't know if I was alive or in a position to use it. Caleb looked at the table for a long moment. 3 cases. His father's and 3 more. 5 sets of people. Probably more if you counted the ones who hadn't documented it or hadn't survived it long enough to document it. 15 years of the same operation, running quietly in the spaces between legitimate transactions, and nobody had ever put the full picture together in one place because the pieces were spread across 4 territories and a dozen counties. And the people who'd been hurt had mostly been hurt individually, in ways that looked like bad luck or personal failure or the ordinary grinding pressure of trying to hold something against a man with more resources. She can get the documents to Forsyth? He asked. She says she can have them in his office in 2 days. Then when we arrive in Helena, everything is in one place. Eliza looked at him. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. The specific quality of a person who has been running toward something for a long time and can finally see it close enough to be real. Forsyth files the challenge to the guardianship order. He files the injunction. He presents the pattern of fraud to the court as part of the context for why the order is suspect. And he files a separate complaint with the Territorial Attorney General's office regarding the land fraud cases. That's a lot of simultaneous legal action. Yes. She didn't apologize for it. It needs to be simultaneous. If Crane has time to respond to one thing at a time, he can absorb it. If 4 things land at once, he can't cover all of them. He can't cover all of them, she agreed. They sat with that for a moment. The fire was burning well, and the cabin was warm, and outside the light was going out of the sky in that gradual winter way, the blue deepening to gray. There's another piece, she said. She said it carefully in the tone of someone who was about to say something they'd been working up to. Tell me, the company. She folded her hands together on the table. Even if we win the legal cases, the guardianship challenge, the fraud complaints, Crane still has a position relative to Hargrove Continental. He's been using his relationship with the board to maneuver himself into operational authority on the grounds that the legitimate heir is incapacitated. She paused. If I challenge the guardianship and win, I get my legal standing back. But the board has been operating under Crane's influence for 4 months. Some of them will stay loyal to whoever is in the room with the most pressure. And Crane has been building toward a move on the controlling shares. He wants to buy them. He wants to force a sale. There's a provision in the company charter, an obscure one, written into the original documents before my father had the legal sophistication to close it properly. That allows a board to petition for a forced buyout of the controlling interest If the primary shareholder is declared legally incapacitated for more than 6 months, she looked at him directly. In 2 months, I will have been operating under that fraudulent guardianship order for 6 months. The room was very quiet. If we don't resolve this before the 6-month mark, Caleb said slowly, he doesn't need to win the legal cases. He doesn't need to find me and physically take me into custody. He just needs to run out the clock. Her voice was level, but the effort of keeping it level was visible. He's been buying time from the beginning. The legal challenges, the search, they're partially real and they're partially theater. What he actually needed was 6 months. Caleb sat back and looked at the ceiling. How long ago was the guardianship order filed? He asked. 6 weeks ago. So the clock has 16 weeks left. Approximately. We don't need to win everything before the 6 months is up, he said, thinking it through. We need to invalidate the guardianship order before the 6 months is up. If the order is thrown out, the 6-month clock stops. She let out a breath that was not quite steady. Yes, that's the critical piece. Like everything else, the fraud cases, the board position, the company, those are longer fights. But if the guardianship order is thrown out, I have my legal standing back and the clock resets, and Crane loses the one mechanism that would have let him act without my participation. Then that's the first objective, Caleb said. Everything else is secondary. She nodded, once, with the precision that meant she'd arrived at the same conclusion and was relieved to hear it stated clearly. We leave tomorrow, he said, before first light. That night, neither of them slept particularly well. Caleb was aware of it, the quality of the silence from the back room that was the silence of someone awake rather than asleep, the occasional small sound of movement. He lay on the floor in the main room and stared at the ceiling and let his mind run through logistics rather than push it toward the things that weren't logistics, because the things that weren't logistics were complicated in ways that he didn't have the space to be complicated about right now. He was aware of her, had been aware of her with increasing specificity for, he tried to track it backward honestly, longer than was entirely appropriate given the situation. Not in a way that interfered with his judgment, or that he'd acted on, or that he intended to act on while they were in the middle of something that required clear thinking, but in the specific way that one person becomes aware of another when they've spent 3 weeks in close quarters and the other person has turned out to be someone considerably more interesting than the emergency they arrived as. She was sharp. She was capable of genuine humor when she forgot to be guarded about it. She had the kind of courage that wasn't dramatic, not the kind that announced itself, but the kind that just kept moving forward when moving forward was the hard thing to do, without making a production of the difficulty. She'd been knocked down repeatedly over the past 4 months in ways that would have broken a person less stubborn, and she'd gotten up and kept her thinking clear and hadn't let the fear turn her into something lesser. He thought about what she'd said at the fire in the cottonwood draw. Partners. Not me protecting you and you being grateful. He thought about the way she'd said it, not as a demand, not as a negotiation, but as a simple statement of what was accurate. He hadn't disagreed with it then. He didn't disagree with it now. Eventually, he slept. They left before the sky was light and made good time on the northern route in the first day. The cold dry and the trail clear from the previous day's travel. Eliza rode Hatch with the easy competence she'd developed over the Billings trip, and Caleb watched her from a half-length back when the trail was wide enough and felt the accumulated weight of the previous weeks differently than he had before. Not heavier, just more specific, more particular. On the second day, the weather turned. Not a full storm. The sky had been building something since noon, and by mid-afternoon it was coming down in the thin, driving kind of snow that wasn't deep but reduced visibility and made the trail uncertain. They'd made the Clark Fork Valley by then, and the terrain was easier than the high country, but the river to their north was running under a thin skin of ice that groaned in the cold, and the wind came down the valley in a way that found every gap in their clothing. They pushed through it. There was no good option for shelter, and stopping in the open in these conditions was worse than moving, so they moved. That was the day Eliza's horse threw a shoe. They were 3 miles from a small settlement that Caleb knew had a farrier, and the trail here was hard-packed gravel under the snow, which was bad footing for an unshod hoof. He dismounted and looked at Hatch's left forefoot and said something under his breath that he didn't repeat in her presence, and she got down and looked too. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough. We walk her." He took Hatch's reins. It's 3 miles, better than the alternative. So they walked, both of them on foot, leading both horses, in the driving thin snow through a Clark Fork Valley afternoon that was all gray sky and white ground and the sound of the river. It took over an hour, and his feet were soaked by the end of it, and he suspected hers were too, though she didn't mention it. The farrier in the settlement, which was 4 buildings and a name on a postal route, looked at Hatch with the unhurried attention of a man for whom this was Tuesday, and said he could have the shoe on in an hour. They waited in the small room attached to the building where a wood stove was burning, and a woman who was presumably the farrier's wife or sister or someone's wife or sister offered them coffee without asking who they were, which Caleb appreciated more than he said. Eliza wrapped her hands around the coffee and looked at the stove and said nothing for several minutes. "You're thinking about the 6 months," he said. She glanced at him. "I'm thinking about a lot of things." "Tell me one." She considered it. "I'm thinking about what comes after. If this works. If we get to Helena. If Forsyth files. If the order is thrown out." She looked back at the stove. "I've been so focused on the immediate problem for so long that I haven't let myself think past it. It feels dangerous to think past it, like it might not happen if I assume it will." "That's a superstition," he said. "I know." A pause. "I'm not usually superstitious." "What does it look like after?" She was quiet for a moment. "I go back to Helena. I take control of the company, as much control as I can establish quickly before Crane can maneuver the board further. I spend the next year probably fighting in courtrooms and boardrooms simultaneously." She traced the rim of the coffee cup with one finger. "It's not a peaceful picture." "No, but it's mine." She said it quietly, with a directness that wasn't defiance and wasn't pride exactly, more like a person naming what they'd been trying to hold on to when everything around them was designed to take it away. "That's what I keep coming back to. It's mine, not because I was born into it, or not only because of that, because I'm the one who's been fighting for it." He looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing. I just think your father understood you better than you give him credit for." She looked at him, and something moved in her face, complicated, unresolved, the grief and the frustration, and something else that was warmer than either. "Maybe," she said. "I'll let you know when I've finished being angry at him." The horse was shod in just over an hour, and they paid the farrier and got back on the trail, and the snow had lightened to something manageable, and they made another 8 miles before they camped. They reached Helena on the afternoon of the 4th day. Forsyth's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building on the main commercial street, and it looked like the office of a man who kept everything and threw away nothing. Stacks of documents on every surface, an architectural quality to the piles that suggested a system comprehensible only to the person who'd created it. He was a small man in his 60s with the quick, bird-like movements of someone whose mind moved faster than his body had ever managed. And he looked at Eliza for a long moment when she came through the door with the expression of a man who was very glad to see a thing he'd been afraid he'd lost. "Eliza," he said. "Mr. Forsyth." She shook his hand in the businesslike way she shook hands, and he held on a moment longer than the handshake required. Then he looked at Caleb. "Caleb Rourke," she said. "He's been necessary." "Mr. Rourke," Forsyth said. He had the quality of sizing a person up very quickly and not being wrong about what he saw. "I've been informed about your father's case. I understand you have documents. In the saddlebag." Caleb had brought the crate in from Hatch's pack and set it on the floor inside the door. "Everything my father kept." Forsyth looked at this crate with a concentration that was almost physical. "Margaret sent her documents 2 days ago. I've been going through them." He moved to his desk, or rather to the organized chaos that served as his desk, and picked up a thick folder. What she found, combined with what I can already document from the Hargrove estate records, gives us a picture of Aldous Crane that is, he paused, selecting the word, comprehensive. "How comprehensive?" Eliza asked. "Comprehensive enough that I've already contacted the Territorial Attorney General's office. They're expecting a filing by end of week." He looked at both of them. "But first things first, the guardianship order." They worked for the rest of that day and into the evening. Forsyth had a second attorney, a younger woman named Aldrich, who specialized in property law and who had the particular quality of being able to read a document and identify its weakest points faster than anyone Caleb had ever seen. She read Crane's guardianship filing in 11 minutes and then looked up and said flatly, "The examining physicians aren't registered in the territory, neither of them. They're registered in Idaho, and the Idaho Licensing Board suspended both of them in 1884. The room was very quiet for a moment. "He used suspended physicians," Eliza said, "to sign affidavits supporting a competency hearing in a Montana territorial court," Aldrich said, "which is either very sloppy or he didn't expect anyone to look closely," Caleb said, "because nobody was going to be in a position to mount a legal challenge. He was banking on her being physically inaccessible," Forsyth said. "He was already writing. The filing he submitted to the Butte probate court didn't require verification of the physician's credentials because nobody questioned it. Nobody questioned it because the woman it concerned was running across the territory in a blizzard." He looked up at Eliza. He assumed that by the time anyone could challenge it, the 6-month provision would have already activated. "File the challenge," Eliza said. "Tonight if you can." "I can't file tonight. The court office is closed, first thing in the morning." Forsyth set down his pen and looked at her over the stacks of paper. "There is one more thing, Eliza, something we need to discuss." She waited. "Even with the guardianship order thrown out, and I believe it will be thrown out, probably within the week once a judge looks at those physician credentials, Crane still has leverage over the company. He's been working the board. 3 board members have signed documents giving him advisory authority over major operational decisions while you were under the guardianship order." He folded his hands. "Those documents are legal. They were signed by legitimate board members with the authority to sign them. The only way to break them is to either convince those board members to rescind or take them to a shareholder vote," Eliza said, "which requires a full shareholder meeting, which requires 30 days' notice under the company charter." "I know." She was very still. Caleb watched her the way he always watched her when something difficult was being said, looking for the thing that happened underneath the controlled expression. What he saw was someone arriving at a decision they'd already been working toward without quite finishing it. "I've been thinking about this since we talked about the 6-month provision." She looked at Forsyth. "What is the company actually worth without me?" Forsyth blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The controlling interest, the shares my father left me. What are they worth if I'm removed from the picture? If Crane gets what he's been working toward and takes operational control?" Forsyth looked uncomfortable. "Eliza, I'm not asking because I'm considering selling," she said, with a patience that was very firm around the edges. "I'm asking because I need to understand the arithmetic of what Crane is actually trying to take." Forsyth named a number. It was a large number, the kind of number that explained everything: the lengths, the forged documents, the suspended physicians, the men in the tree line, the bruise along her jaw. "And what are they worth if I retain control and clean up the fraud that's been running through the company's land acquisitions for the past decade?" Forsyth looked at her for a moment. Then he named a different number, considerably larger. She nodded slowly. "So the fraud isn't incidental to the company's value. It's load-bearing. If it gets exposed, several of the land positions Crane helped broker for Hargrove Continental become legally questionable. The company's asset base shrinks considerably." Forsyth's voice was careful. "It would require restructuring, settlements with the affected parties. It would be a difficult period." "But it would be real," Eliza said. "The value that remained would be real." Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "It would be real." She was quiet. Then, "What if I don't fight for the board? What if instead of spending the next year in courtrooms arguing over advisory authority documents, I call the shareholder meeting and I stand in front of the shareholders and I tell them everything?" Aldrich looked up from her papers. "Everything," Eliza said. "The fraud, the land acquisitions that are legally questionable. What Crane has been doing, what some of those acquisitions cost the people they were taken from." She paused, and for a moment Caleb saw something in her face that was connected to the conversation in the Cottonwood camp, to what she'd said about the company being hers, not because she was born into it, but because she was the one fighting for it. If the shareholders know the real picture, they can make a real choice. And if the real picture means the company is worth less, but structured honestly, I'd rather have that. The room was quiet for several seconds. "That is," Forsyth said carefully, A very significant thing to propose. I know. The litigation alone, the settlements with the affected landholders, could take 5 years. Then it takes 5 years. Forsyth looked at her. Then he looked at Caleb, briefly, with the expression of a man trying to read the context. Caleb said nothing. He was watching Eliza with the same attention he gave to things that were important and worth getting right. She was looking at Forsyth with her jaw set and her hands flat on the desk, and the controlled expression fully down, just her looking at him and meaning exactly what she'd said. "Start with the guardianship challenge," she said, "first thing in the morning, and add to the filing a request for an emergency injunction barring Crane from any further action on behalf of the company pending resolution of the guardianship matter." "That I can do," Forsyth said. "And contact the Territorial Attorney General's office tonight if you can reach them. Tell them the filing is coming and that the evidence includes documented fraud across 5 separate transactions in 3 territories." "5," Aldrich said quietly, looking at her papers. "With Mr. Rourke's documents, I count 6. 6. Caleb heard the number and felt it settle somewhere inside him the way heavy things settled. Not lightly, not cleanly, but permanently. 6 cases. His father's among them. 15 years of it, documented, in a stack of papers on a desk in Helena. 6, Eliza said. She glanced at him briefly. Just a glance, just a moment of acknowledgement, and then back to Forsyth. "Tonight, if you can." Forsyth reached for his coat. "Okay." They stayed in Helena that night in a boarding house that Forsyth arranged, the best one in the city, which was the first time Caleb had slept in a proper bed in weeks. He lay in it and stared at the ceiling of a room that was warm and quiet and felt it all in the way you felt things after they'd been compressed for a long time and then suddenly had space to expand. He thought about his father. He thought about the box of papers that had sat in the corner of the back room of the cabin for 8 years, waiting for a use he hadn't known it would have. He thought about Eliza in the room down the hall, probably not sleeping, probably working through the next steps in her head the way she always worked through things, methodically, without flinching at the difficult parts. He thought about what she'd said. "I'd rather have that. Not the larger number, not the value built on fraud. The smaller, real thing." In the morning, they went back to Forsyth's office and sat in the organized chaos of his workspace while he filed the challenge and the injunction request and the complaint to the Attorney General, one after another, with Aldrich beside him catching every word. And Caleb sat in a chair against the wall and watched it happen, and felt the specific quality of something that had been building for 15 years finally releasing its pressure. Not finished, not clean, not the end of anything, really. Just the beginning of the longer fight that Eliza had said would take 5 years and had chosen anyway. But the clock had started moving differently. And in 12 days, when the circuit judge arrived in Harlan's Creek, there would be an injunction waiting for him, filed from Helena, signed by a judge who had read the physician credentials and the fraud documents and understood exactly what he was looking at. And Aldous Crane, in his hotel room 11 miles south of Caleb's cabin, did not know any of this yet. That was a window, small and closing, but real. Caleb looked across the room at Eliza, who was bent over a document Forsyth was pointing to, her finger running down the page and her expression concentrated and alive. And he thought about the junction he'd been standing at since the night she'd told him her real name. The one where both roads were visible, but only one was going to be permanent. He'd taken it already. Somewhere between the tree line and the telegraph office and the cottonwood camp, without marking the specific moment, he'd taken it. He didn't regret it. The injunction arrived in Harlan's Creek by telegraph on the 8th day, 4 days before the circuit judge was due, which gave Purcell the legal cover he'd been waiting for. Caleb was in town when the message came through, standing in Greer's telegraph office, watching the man's face as he read the incoming transmission, and he saw the exact moment Purcell's position shifted from careful neutrality to something with a spine in it. Purcell read the telegram twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who had been carrying something uncomfortable and had just been relieved of it. "The guardianship order has been suspended pending a competency hearing in Helena," Purcell said. "Emergency injunction, signed by Judge Harlan Morse." He paused. "That's a Helena judge, Senior Bent." "I know who he is," Caleb said. "Crane's legal standing to conduct a search in this jurisdiction. Gone, as of this document." Purcell tapped his coat pocket. I'll be informing him of this afternoon. I'd like to be there when you do, Caleb said. Purcell looked at him for a moment. I thought you might. Quab. Crane was in the hotel dining room when they found him, eating a late breakfast with the unhurried quality of a man who still believed the morning belonged to him. He had one of his men at a table nearby, the large flat-faced one from the general store in Billings, as it happened, and he looked up when Purcell and Caleb came in with the particular alertness of someone whose instincts were very good, even when his information was incomplete. Purcell set the telegram on the table in front of him without ceremony. Crane read it. He read it the way he did everything, without rushing, without visible reaction. When he finished, he set it down and looked up, first at Purcell and then at Caleb. Mr. Rourke, he said. His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant, Caleb thought. That was the thing about him. The pleasantness never went away. It just became a different kind of pleasant, depending on what was underneath it. Right now, it was the pleasantness of a man calculating his next position. I see you've been busy. Sheriff Purcell will explain the legal implications, Caleb said. I'm just here to observe. Purcell explained them with the patient directness of a man who had spent 5 years telling people things they didn't want to hear. The guardianship order was suspended. The advisory authority documents Crane had obtained from the Hargrove Continental Board were under review as part of the injunction. Any further action taken by Crane or his agents in the jurisdiction of Harlan's Creek on the basis of those documents would constitute contempt of the Helena court. Crane listened to all of it. When Purcell finished, he folded his napkin neatly and placed it beside his plate. I'll need to consult with my attorneys, he said. That's your right, Purcell said. There will be a response filed in Helena within 48 hours. Also, you're right. Purcell picked up the telegram from the table. In the meantime, Mr. Crane, I'd ask that you and your men stay within the boundaries of this town and don't ride out toward the northern properties. The injunction is specific about interference. A pause. Something moved behind Crane's eyes. Not fear exactly, but the first real crack in the certainty. The moment when a man who has always operated with the confidence of predetermined outcomes begins to understand that this particular outcome was not predetermined. Of course, he said. Outside, in the cold street, Caleb stood for a moment and breathed the air and didn't say anything for a while. Purcell stood beside him. Your father's case, Purcell said. Not a question. He'd clearly done some reading in the past 8 days. Dakota Territory? Yes. Purcell was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry I couldn't have done that sooner. You didn't know sooner, Caleb said, and the situation wasn't yours to solve. No, Purcell agreed. But still, they stood in the cold together for another minute, two men with nothing else immediately required of them, watching the street move around them with its ordinary commerce and ordinary trouble, unchanged by the thing that had just happened in the hotel dining room. Then Caleb went to get his horse and rode north. The full competency hearing in Helena took place 11 days later. Forsyth had done what he'd said he would do, filed the challenge, presented the physician credentials, produced the documentation of the pattern of fraud in a package that Judge Morse described in his written ruling as among the most thorough evidentiary submissions he had received in 14 years on the bench. The guardianship order was thrown out in its entirety. The two Idaho physicians were referred to the Territorial Marshal's office for investigation. The Butte probate court judge who had signed the original order without verifying the physician's credentials was formally censured. Eliza was present for the ruling. Caleb sat in the gallery and watched her receive it, standing at the plaintiff's table beside Forsyth, in proper clothes for the first time since he'd known her, her dark hair up and her back straight. She didn't react visibly when Morse read the decision. She thanked Forsyth quietly, shook Aldrich's hand, and then turned and found Caleb's eyes in the gallery. And what passed between them across that distance was not a smile and not a look of relief. It was the specific acknowledgement of two people who have been through something difficult together and are standing on the other side of it. He nodded once. She nodded back. Outside the courthouse, in the January cold that was somehow less punishing in Helena than it had been on the trail, she stood beside him on the steps and let herself be still for the first time in what was probably months. He could feel it, the compression releasing, the same way it had released in him in the Harlan's Creek street after the conversation with Purcell. A person's body carrying something for a long time and finally putting it down. First thing's finished, he said. First thing, she agreed. About 14 more to go. I know. He looked at the street below the courthouse steps. How long before the shareholder meeting? Forsyth is filing the notice today. 30 days. She was quiet for a moment. It's going to be ugly. When I stand up in front of those shareholders and tell them what the land acquisitions actually cost. Some of them knew. Some of them benefited. They're not going to be grateful for the honesty. No. And the restructuring, that's the settlements with the affected families, that's going to take resources the company is going to feel. I know that too. She looked at him sideways. You're not going to tell me it's worth it. I wasn't going to tell you anything. You know whether it's worth it. She was quiet for a moment, then, almost to herself, my father built something real. Under the fraud, under the arrangements that shouldn't have been made. There's a real operation. People who work the lines, the land, the logistics. People who've built their livelihoods around it. She paused. I want that to survive. The real part. Then you'll make it survive, he said. Not as encouragement, as a statement of what he'd observed over the past several weeks, about what she was and what she did with what she was. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and honest and didn't try to be less than either. Come to the shareholder meeting, she said. He hadn't expected the question. Why? Because I want someone in that room who I trust to tell me if I'm getting something wrong. She held his gaze. And because I'll do better knowing you're there. He looked at her for a moment. The winter sky above Helena was pale and flat, and the street below was full of its ordinary noise. And there was nothing romantic in the setting and nothing convenient about the timing and several logistical problems he could immediately identify with what she was asking. All right, he said. That was tea. The shareholder meeting was held in the first week of March, in the main conference room of the Hargrove Continental offices in Helena, a room that smelled of old wood and tobacco and the particular anxious quality of money being uncertain about itself. There were 31 shareholders present, ranging from old associates of Arthur Hargrove, who had known the man for decades, to newer investors who had bought in under the assumption that the company's trajectory was permanently upward. Caleb sat in the back row and watched. Eliza stood at the front of the room for 2.5 hours. She didn't use notes after the first 20 minutes. She knew the material the way she knew the numbers in the ledger, completely and from the inside. She told them about the land acquisitions. She named the cases, 6 of them, his father's among them. She showed them the documents, Crane's letters, the altered county records, the forged signatures. She told them what the settlements would cost and what the honest restructuring would look like, and what the company would be worth afterward and what it would be built on. 3 of the shareholders walked out during the first hour. 2 more left at the break, the rest stayed. When she was finished, there was a silence in the room that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable and then longer than that. Then a man in the second row, one of the old associates, a man who had known Arthur Hargrove from the beginning, asked a question about the timeline for the settlements. Not a hostile question, a practical one. And that was the moment the room shifted. It didn't shift smoothly or completely. It never does. 2 of the remaining shareholders voted against the resolution to pursue settlements and restructuring. 3 abstained, but the resolution passed, and when it passed, Eliza wrote it down in the minute book in her own handwriting and closed the book and set it on the table. And Caleb watched her from the back of the room and thought about something she'd said weeks ago. In a cabin that was currently sitting empty and slightly cold in the Bitterroot foothills, waiting for him to come back to it. It's mine. Not because I was born into it, because I'm the one who's been fighting for it. He thought she'd been right then. He was more certain of it now. On. Aldous Crane's response to the Helena court proceedings came in the form of a counterfiling that Forsyth described as ambitious, which was his way of saying it was elaborate and had no realistic chance of succeeding. Over the next 6 weeks, Crane filed 3 separate legal challenges to the injunction, to the competency ruling, to the Territorial Attorney General's investigation of the land fraud cases. All 3 were heard by judges who had read the evidentiary package. All 3 were denied. In April, the Territorial Marshal's Office arrested the 2 Idaho physicians on charges of fraud and filing false affidavits. In May, the The county recorder in Dakota Territory, the same man named in Caleb's father's papers, now retired and living in Minnesota, was named as a respondent in the Attorney General's civil case. In June, the Butte probate judge who had signed the guardianship order resigned. Crane himself was never arrested. This was the part that sat sideways in Caleb's chest in a way that he didn't pretend otherwise. The man had orchestrated 6 documented instances of fraud, had used forged documents and corrupt officials and physical intimidation across 15 years, and had done it with enough layers of separation between himself and the specific acts that proving criminal intent against him personally was the kind of legal project that could take a decade and still fail. Forsyth was honest about that. The civil cases will cost him significantly, Forsyth said, in one of the conversations in his office that had become a regular feature of the months following the shareholder meeting. The land positions that were acquired through fraud have to be unwound. Several of his business partners have already distanced themselves. The legal exposure isn't worth the association. His standing in the territory is substantially diminished. But not gone, Caleb said. No, not gone. Forsyth looked at him directly. Men like Crane rarely disappear completely. They diminish. They lose the conditions that made them powerful. They become a smaller version of what they were, and they operate at that smaller level. He paused. It's not the ending that satisfies a dramatic instinct, but it's the realistic one. Caleb sat with that for a moment. He'd known it, in the part of his mind that dealt in the realistic rather than the desired. He'd known since the hotel dining room in Harlan's Creek, the moment when Crane had read the telegram and made his calculation and said, "I'll need to consult with my attorneys," that this was not a man who broke. He bent. He reconfigured. He found the smaller space available to him, and he occupied it. "What about the affected families?" Caleb asked. "From the other cases, not just my father's." Forsyth opened a folder on his desk. The Hargrove Continental Settlement Fund has been established. 5 of the 6 cases have living family members who have been contacted. The process is slow, and some of them are understandably skeptical. He paused. Yours is the most straightforward, legally, because your father's case was already litigated and the original verdict stands. The settlement offer is for the legal costs incurred in a land assessment value for the property at the time of the dispute. It was not a large number. The land had not been worth a large number in 1872, but it was what the fight had cost, accounted for, real and specific. "I'll take it," Caleb said. He was back at the cabin by early July. It was strange coming back to it after months in Helena. The smallness of the 2 rooms, the particular quality of the quiet, the way the lean-to smelled of horses and hay. He'd been away long enough that it felt slightly unfamiliar, the way a place does when you've been inside a larger life for a while and then returned to the smaller one. He spent the first week putting things right. The cattle needed attention. Hadley had done what he'd promised and more, but there were things that had accumulated in the months of absence, small repairs and maintenance, and the ordinary work of a property that had been minimally attended. He worked through the list methodically and didn't think too much about what came next, because thinking about what came next was a thing he'd been doing for months, and he needed a break from it. On the 8th day, Eliza arrived. She came up the South Trail in the early afternoon on a horse he didn't recognize. A good bay, well-fed and well-shod, clearly Helena stock. She was dressed practically, travel clothes, her hair in the braid she wore when she expected to be doing something with her hands. She pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked at him where he was standing at the woodpile with a splitting maul in his hand, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then, "You left Helena without saying anything." "I left Helena," he said, "because the work there was done and this place needed attention." "You could have said that. I thought it was obvious." She looked at him with an expression that was trying to be irritated and wasn't entirely succeeding. She dismounted and led the bay to the hitching post and tied her, and came across the yard to where he was standing. "The settlement was finalized," she said. "Your family's case. Forsyth wanted you there for the signing. I gave him a letter of authorization." "I know. He told me." She stopped a few feet from him, hands in her coat pockets. "I wanted to tell you in person. It's done." He set the maul down and looked at her. "Thank you." She looked back at him steadily. There were things in her face that had been there for months, building through the courtrooms and the shareholder meeting and the late nights in Forsyth's office. A different quality than the controlled, compressed expression she'd arrived with out of the snowdrift. Something less defended. Something that had been allowed to develop because the survival emergency had passed, and there was finally space for things to be what they actually were. "I'm going to need to be in Helena most of the time," she said, "for the foreseeable future. The restructuring is going to take years, and I can't manage it from a distance." "I know that. But I don't want to only be in Helena." She said it plainly, in the direct way she said everything that mattered. "I want—" She stopped, gathered it. "I built something back there in those few weeks. In this specific place, with this specific—" She stopped again. "I'm not saying this particularly well." "You're saying it fine," he said. "I want to know that this is somewhere I can come back to." She looked at him. Not because I need rescuing again, not because I need somewhere to hide, just because you want to," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. The July light was warm on the yard, and the mountains were visible to the north, and the cattle were in the lower meadow, making the ordinary sounds of cattle, doing nothing in particular, and it was all very ordinary and specific and real. "You know what you're actually asking," he said. "Yes," she said, "I do." "Then you know my answer." "Oh, my—" She held his gaze for a moment, and the careful, controlled expression came down the rest of the way. All of it, nothing held back. And what was there underneath was just her, tired and determined, and something else that had been building since a snowdrift and a pair of oversized wool socks and a table covered in papers. And she looked at him like a person who had stopped needing to manage what was visible. "I know," she said quietly. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, the kind of thing you did without thinking about it, and she caught his hand briefly and held it there, and neither of them made it into more than it was. Just two people standing in a yard in the afternoon sun who had earned the right to be where they were. The year that followed was not simple. Nothing about their life was simple, and neither of them had expected it to be. Eliza went back to Helena, and Caleb stayed at the cabin, and they wrote letters, practical letters mostly, about the cases and the restructuring and the logistics of what was happening. And she came back when she could, which was not as often as either of them would have preferred, and more often than the practical situation probably justified. The settlements moved slowly. The Attorney General's civil case against Crane dragged through 2 separate courts before a partial judgment was entered that required him to divest several of the fraudulently acquired land positions. It wasn't everything. It was far from everything. But it was real, and it was documented, and it was on the permanent record of what the man had done. The families from the other cases were contacted, negotiated with, settled with, some more successfully than others. The family from the most recent case, a cattle operation in eastern Montana that had been forced out in 1883, declined the settlement and filed their own suit, which Forsyth thought had a reasonable chance of succeeding on different grounds. Caleb hoped they were right. By the second year, Hargrove Continental was smaller and more financially strained than it had been, and was, for the first time in a decade, operating entirely on legitimate ground. Eliza told him this on a Tuesday in October when she'd been at the cabin for 3 days, and they were eating dinner, and she said it in the same matter-of-fact way she said most things, without drama. "It's not a triumphant moment exactly," she said. "The numbers are what they are. Some of the shareholders who left haven't come back. We lost 2 major contracts in the restructuring. But it's real," he said. "It's real." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I keep thinking about what my father would think, whether he'd be proud of it or frustrated at me for burning down what he built. What do you think?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I think he prepared me for exactly this, even if he didn't know that's what he was doing. He made sure I could read a contract and understand a balance sheet and know when someone was lying. He just didn't tell me what for." She paused. "Maybe he knew that if he told me, I'd look at what he was building and ask the question sooner." "And you would have," Caleb said. "Probably." A pause. "Yes." He looked at her across the table, the same table where she'd read his father's papers the first time, where they'd planned the ride to Billings, where they'd sat after Crane left and started working out how to beat him. The cabin hadn't changed much. He'd replaced the board in the near left corner where the log had been checking. He'd built a proper shelf for her books, which had arrived in a box from Helena 3 months ago and which now occupied one wall of the back room. Small adjustments. The ordinary accumulation of a shared life that didn't announce itself. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "About a broken horseshoe," he said. She looked at him. Then she understood it. The thing that had started all of it. The reason he'd been on that particular trail on that particular day in January 2 years ago. A horseshoe that needed replacing and had sent him south when he'd planned to go north, along the Ridgeline Trail in a blizzard where a woman was half buried in a snowdrift. "A horseshoe," she said. "A broken one. 3 months before I found you, I'd been thinking about replacing it and kept putting it off because the horse wasn't showing any trouble. If I'd replaced it when I meant to, I'd have taken the North Trail that day." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark pine eyes that had been taking him apart and cataloging the pieces since the first morning she'd opened them in his back room. Then she said, "You're going to tell me something about the randomness of things. I'm going to tell you that I stopped believing things happened for reasons a long time ago," he said. "I believe things happen, and then other things follow from them. And sometimes what follows is terrible, and sometimes what follows changes everything. And the difference is almost never about deserving." She was quiet. "What I know is this," he said. "My father fought that case, and it cost him everything, and he died thinking he'd lost. But he kept the papers. He kept every letter and every document, and he gave them to me, and I kept them for 15 years in a box in the corner of a room, because throwing them away felt like losing the last evidence that the thing had actually happened." He looked at her. "Those papers are in Forsyth's files right now. They're part of the permanent record of what Crane did and how it was done. 5 other families have their cases documented because my father was meticulous and stubborn and refused to let the record disappear." "Tulmam Beitki Bishotax." He paused. He didn't know that's what he was doing. He was just a man who couldn't stand the idea of the truth being buried. She looked at him with an expression that had nothing defended in it and nothing performed. "He won," she said quietly. "He just didn't live to see it." "No," Caleb said. "He didn't. The fire burned. The night was outside, cold and large and indifferent, in the way that the Montana Territory was always indifferent. It didn't care about the things that happened within it, didn't arrange itself to accommodate them or punish them or provide lessons about them. A woman could freeze to death on a trail, and the snow would fall regardless. A man could lose everything he'd built, and the land would still be there in the spring. That indifference was not cruelty. It was just the shape of the world, and you operated within it as best you could, and you made the choices that let you look at yourself straight. Caleb Rourke had made those choices. He thought he'd made the right ones, not the easy ones. Right and easy had almost nothing to do with each other, in his experience, but the ones he could account for honestly when he sat alone with them. Across the table, Eliza Hargrove was looking at the fire with her hands wrapped around her cup and her face open and tired and real. And she was here, in this specific place she'd chosen to come back to, and whatever she'd lost in the year of fighting, the large fortune, the uncomplicated inheritance, the version of herself that hadn't yet been through what she'd been through, she didn't look diminished by the absence of it. She looked like herself, the real version, the one that had been underneath the controlled expression all along. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad Ghost stopped." He looked at her. "When he found me," she said, "I'm glad he stopped instead of walking around." He thought about Ghost standing dead in his tracks on the Ridgeline Trail with the stubbornness of an animal that had decided something mattered and wasn't going to be argued with. 14 years old, gray in the muzzle now, currently eating hay in the lean-to with the same indifferent competence he brought to everything. "So am I," Caleb said. Outside, the October wind moved through the pines on the ridge, and the cattle were quiet in the lower meadow, and the mountains stood where they'd always stood. And inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily in the stone fireplace, and 2 people sat across a table from each other in the particular warmth of a life they had built without a template, from the pieces available to them, imperfectly and honestly, and without any guarantee of how it would hold. It held. That was the thing about choosing correctly, Caleb thought. Not the choosing itself. The choosing was just a moment. What mattered was the long, ordinary time after it, the weeks and years of a life that was neither triumphant nor simple, but was genuinely, stubbornly yours. He'd had less than that once. A box of papers in a corner and a quiet operation, and the cold comfort of needing nothing from anyone. This was harder and smaller and more specific and more real. He wouldn't have traded it.